Hey there and welcome back. If you are settling in now, perhaps drawing the covers a bit higher, letting the minor frets of the day loosen their hold, letting the muscles of the jaw and the shoulders begin to release, letting the breath you have been holding without quite realizing it ease its way out. Good. Because tonight we are going somewhere I think you are going to enjoy. Tonight we are going on a sea voyage. Tonight we are going to spend 6 days at sea on what was, in the late summer of 1911, the most famous ship in the world. You may already, before I have said another word, have a ship in mind. The first thing the human imagination tends to summon when it hears the words most famous Edwardian ocean liner is a specific ship that struck a chosen iceberg on an individual April night in 1912 and went down with most of the people aboard her. That ship is not our ship. Our ship is her older sister. Our ship is the one that did not sink. Our ship sailed for 24 years, carried perhaps 250,000 passengers across the Atlantic in her long working life, served as a troop ship in the Great War, and earned the nickname Old Reliable, and was finally retired in 1935 and broken up at the yards in Jarrow. She was, by every reasonable account from the people who actually sailed on her, the most beloved liner of her generation. Her name was the Olympic. The Olympic and the Titanic were sister ships. They were built side by side at the Harland and Wolff yards in Belfast by the same engineers from the same plans, with matching fittings, furnishings, staircases, and dining saloons. The Olympic was the first to be completed and the first to enter service in June 1911. The Titanic was still being fitted out at Belfast on the night we are about to begin. She would not enter service until April 1912. She would sink 5 days into her maiden voyage. The world that knows her ship as a tomb has never quite caught up with the fact that her ship had a sister, and that the sister lived a long, full life, and that the sister was, in the late summer of 1911, the proudest object afloat. Tonight we are going to sail on the sister. Nothing terrible will happen. The crossing will be, by every standard the crossing was meant to be measured by, a complete success. Settle in. We are going to take this slowly. Tonight, you are a young woman called Charlotte. You are 28 years old. You were born in Philadelphia in the spring of 1883, the eldest daughter of a banking family that has been comfortable in Philadelphia for 4 generations. You were educated at home by governesses, finished at a restrained school in Switzerland, brought out into Philadelphia society at 19, and married 3 years ago to the younger son of an English earl, a man you met when he was attached to the British Embassy in Washington, and who has since returned to England to take up a permanent position at the Foreign Office in London. The marriage was a love match, slightly unusually for the era and for the families involved. You have lived in a small but beautifully arranged house in South Kensington for nearly 3 years. You have not yet had children. The question of when you will is one that has begun, in the private way of these things, to be a topic of deliberate conversation between you and your husband, but the question is not, on this notable crossing, a pressing one. You have just spent the month of August in New York and Philadelphia visiting your widowed mother and your 2 younger sisters. Your father died in March of last year. The visit to Philadelphia was in part the long-postponed family reunion that his death had made necessary. The visit to New York was the lighter portion of the trip, a fortnight of theatre and shopping and dinners with old friends from your debutante season. You sailed from New York Harbor at noon yesterday, although yesterday is the wrong word, because the time on the ship is its own time, and the night that has just passed is the night you do not yet quite know how to count. We will come to the timekeeping of the Atlantic crossing in due course. For the moment, simply hold this. You boarded the Olympic at the White Star Pier on West 20th Street at 10 o'clock in the morning of the last Wednesday of August 1911. The ship sailed at noon. You are now, as our story begins, 20 hours into a 6-day eastbound crossing that will end at Southampton on the following Tuesday afternoon, and that will, after a boat train to London, deliver you to Waterloo Station at sunset, where your husband will be waiting for you on the platform. Hold that final image, if it helps. The husband on the platform at sunset on Tuesday. The crossing is everything between now and then. Travelling with you, in the confined adjacent cabin that the better staterooms provide, is your French lady's maid Hortense. She is 32 years old, has been with you since shortly after your marriage, and is, in the way of the better Edwardian ladies' maids, the underlying organising intelligence behind everything, from the unpacking of the trunks, to the management of the bath times, to the thoughtful negotiation with the cabin steward about the hour at which morning tea should be brought. Hortense has crossed the Atlantic 4 times in your service. The crossing is, for her, a simpler proposition than it is for you, because she does not have to perform the social functions of the dining saloon and the lounge and the deck. She eats in the second-class dining room with the other personal servants of first-class passengers. She sleeps in the cabin next to yours. She comes to you in the morning to dress you, and at 6 in the evening to dress you again, and the rest of the time she does her own quiet work in the cabin and the corridor and the second-class deck, where the personal servants of first-class passengers are permitted to take their air. Your luggage on this crossing is 17 pieces. This is by the standards of a wealthy American woman crossing the Atlantic in 1911, a moderate quantity. There are women on board with 30 pieces, with 40, with the sort of luggage train that requires a plain army of porters at the dock to manage. Your 17 pieces include 4 Louis Vuitton wardrobe trunks, the tall ones that stand upright and open like a piece of furniture with hanging space on one side and drawers on the other, in the specific monogrammed canvas that the Vuitton workshop in Paris had been producing for the better part of half a century. There are 2 large Goyard steamer trunks. There are 4 hat boxes. There are 2 shoe trunks. There are 3 plain dressing cases in red leather, fitted with silver-topped bottles and brushes and combs and the brief accoutrements of the daily toilette. There is a plain jewellery case in black morocco that travels separately and is kept in the ship's safe rather than in your cabin. There is, finally, a single small overnight bag that contains the things you will want at hand for the journey, and that has been brought directly to your cabin by the cabin steward. The Olympic herself is the most expensive moving object in the world. She cost, when she was built, somewhere in the region of £1.5 million, which in 1911 currency was a sum that would have built a sizable English country estate or refurbished a minor cathedral. She is 882 feet long. She has 9 decks above the waterline. She has space for 2,435 passengers and a crew of nearly 900. She is registered at 45,324 gross tons, which makes her, until her younger sister enters service the following year, the largest moving object that human beings have ever built. She has a top speed of around 23 knots, which is not the fastest on the Atlantic. The Cunard sisters Mauretania and Lusitania are faster, but the White Star Line has long since decided that on the New York run it will compete on luxury and steadiness rather than on speed. And the Olympic is in the late summer of 1911 the most luxurious moving object that has ever existed. The price of crossing the Atlantic on her is graded carefully according to the sort of life you are being permitted to live for the 6 days. Down in the lower decks, in third class the White Star Line, in a slender marketing flourish, prefers the term third class to steerage a single ticket from Southampton to New York, or the reverse costs roughly £7, which is a substantial sum for the working-class emigrant family whose savings it represents but a minor fraction of what the same crossing costs at the upper end. Second class is around £13, perfectly comfortable in its own way, with the sort of cabins and dining saloons that on a less spectacular ship would have been first class. The lower end of first class, the inside cabins on the lower decks of the first-class accommodation, costs around £30. The middle range of first class, the outside cabins on B and C decks with private bathrooms, runs from roughly £50 to £80. The upper end, the largest staterooms and the smaller suites, runs from £150 to £250, and at the very top, in the two parlour suites on B deck, with their private promenade decks and their multiple bedrooms and their sitting rooms in 18th century French style, the price for a single one-way crossing in peak season is £870. £870 in 1911 is, in modern income terms, somewhere between £600,000 and £700,000 for a 6-day crossing. The two parlour suites are not, in any meaningful sense, accommodations that a person merely buys. They are the sort of thing that the Vanderbilts and the Astors and the Rothschilds reserve months in advance because no one else can afford them. We will meet, in due course, the gentleman who has been issued a kind of standing reservation on these suites for as long as he wishes to use them. His name is John Pierpont Morgan, and his name is on the ship in more than one sense. We will come to him. Your own ticket on this crossing is £52. You are in a single occupancy outside cabin on B deck, midships on the starboard side, with a private bath. The cabin is decorated in what the White Star Line calls the Louis Quinze style pale grey panelling with the gilded mouldings of the 18th century French taste, a bed with a straightforward canopy, a writing desk, a wardrobe, a plain dressing table, a tiny armchair upholstered in pale rose silk. The bath is in a limited adjacent room, with white porcelain fittings and brass taps and a chosen seawater bath option that some of the regular crossers prefer, and that you, on your previous crossings, have not. Your £52 in modern income terms is somewhere around £40,000 for the 6 days. By the standards of your husband, who manages the household accounts with the close attention that the younger son of an English earl on a Foreign Office salary needs to bring to the question of his American wife's travelling expenses, this is a reasonable but not extravagant fare. You could have travelled more cheaply. You could have travelled more expensively. The mid-range first-class outside cabin with private bath is the standard accommodation for the wife of a serving English diplomat travelling alone with her maid, and it is, accordingly, what you have. Now, 6 days at sea is going to give us time to do this properly. We are going to walk through your crossing slowly, day by day. We are going to sit with you at meals and walk with you on the boat deck and stand with you at the rail in the late afternoon when the Atlantic light is at its most extraordinary. We are going to dress with you for dinner each evening. The formal dinner on a great Edwardian liner is the most elaborate dinner of the wealthy traveller's year, and the dressings are accordingly considerable. And we are going to attend the captain's table on the 3rd night, and we are going to walk past the smoking room where the gentlemen are at brandy and cigars, and we are going to take tea in the Palm Court while the orchestra plays Strauss, and we are going to encounter in the temporary society that a 6-day crossing assembles and then disperses, an individual set of fellow passengers whose names 115 years later are still names that would be recognized, and a notable set of others whose names have not survived, but whose presence at the next table for 6 days will become, in its minor way, one of the structures of your life on the ship. We are also going to spend a moment in due course with the larger picture, with what this ship represented, and with the world that built her, and with the gentle awareness that I will mention once and then leave alone, that her younger sister was at this very moment being fitted out at Belfast, and that the world we are about to step into was at the very height of its long Edwardian summer, with 3 years still to run before the war that ended it. None of this will weigh on the day we are walking through. The crossing will be lighter than that. The crossing will be, in its own specific way, one of the subdued great pleasures that human history occasionally produces in the lives of certain unadorned fortunate populations of certain specific eras. You are going to enjoy it. So let us go back briefly to yesterday morning and walk in through the gates of the White Star Pier on West 20th Street at the foot of Manhattan and see her for the first time in her full size in the August sun. And then we are going to climb the gangway and go aboard. The White Star Pier at New York was at the foot of West 20th Street, on the Hudson River, in what was at that time the heart of the great Manhattan transatlantic shipping district. The pier had been recently extended to accommodate the new generation of giant liners that the Edwardian shipbuilding revolution had produced, and the extended structure was, in 1911, one of the more substantial piers on the New York waterfront. You arrived at the pier by motor car at 9:30 in the morning, having left your mother's house on Park Avenue at 9:15, and crossed the city through the morning traffic that the new motor cars and the older horse-drawn carriages and the still newer electric trolleys produced in the Manhattan of that chosen summer. Your mother accompanied you to the pier. So did the elder of your 2 younger sisters. The other sister was at home with a slight cold, and had said her goodbyes the previous evening with the individual kind of tearfulness that 22-year-old American girls bring to the parting from elder married sisters who are about to disappear back across the Atlantic for an indefinite period. The first thing you saw as the motor car turned onto the pier and the great shed at the end of the pier came into view was not the ship itself, but the pier shed. The pier shed of the Olympic's New York berth was a long, squat building that ran the length of her side along the dock, and the building had been designed to handle, on a sailing day, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 passengers and their accompanying luggage and the various people who had come to see them off. The shed was in considerable activity when you arrived. There were perhaps 400 porters in their numbered caps. There were perhaps 200 crew members in their various uniforms, the cabin stewards in their white jackets, the dining saloon stewards in their morning coats, the deck stewards in their navy blue, the officers in their dark uniforms with the plain gold rings of their rank on the cuff. There were the customs and immigration officials at their tables, processing the boarding passengers in the measured, methodical way that the regulations of the era required. There were the family groups, the small flotillas of relations gathered at the appropriate unshowy clusters along the floor of the shed, the boarders and their farewell parties together. There were the photographers from the New York newspapers who came to every major sailing of the great liners on the chance that some celebrated face might be present and might be persuaded to pose for a portrait. There were, around the more prominent passengers, the notable small entourages of secretaries and valets, and travelling companions and family members that wealth in this era brought with it. You and your mother and your sister proceeded in the slow procession that the shed's organisation required to the first-class boarding area at the further end of the pier. Your luggage had been delivered the previous afternoon by the tight specialised firm in Manhattan that handled the Atlantic luggage of the wealthy, and it had been already loaded onto the ship and stowed in your cabin and in the sea deck baggage room. Hortense, who had travelled to the pier separately by streetcar, was already at the boarding area when you arrived, having gone aboard at 8 to begin the unpacking of the trunks, and to ensure that everything was in order for your arrival. The first-class boarding procedure was the attentive ritual that the White Star Line had developed over the past 4 decades for the embarkation of its premium passengers. Your tickets and your mother's permission for her and your sister to come aboard for the Bon Voyage hour were inspected. You were directed to the first-class gangway. The gangway itself was the basic covered passage that ran from the pier shed to the side of the ship at B-deck level, with a soft red carpet underfoot, and the plane officer of the watch at the door of the ship, checking each passenger and welcoming them aboard. And it was at the moment of stepping from the pier shed onto the gangway, when the side of the ship rose suddenly above you in its full immediate physical scale, that the impression of the Olympic actually arrived. The ship in photographs, in the postcards that the White Star Line had distributed in the previous several weeks, in the engravings in the newspapers, was one thing. The ship at the side of a New York pier on a sunlit August morning was a completely different thing. She was the size of a building. She was the size of a particularly large London hotel. She rose from the waterline of the Hudson to the level of her boat deck through an unbroken wall of black hull and white superstructure that ran for nearly 900 feet along the dock, with the 4 great buff and black funnels rising above her at a height that, looking up from the gangway, made the buildings of the New York waterfront behind you look small. She was the size of human history's most ambitious single attempt to make a moving thing. You walked up the gangway. You stepped across the neat gap between the gangway and the ship's side. You were welcomed aboard by the officer of the watch, who knew your name from the passenger list, and who consulted, briefly, the list to confirm your cabin number, and who handed you off to the chief steward of B-Deck, who was waiting at the head of the gangway to escort first-class passengers to their accommodation. The chief steward of B-Deck was a man called Mr. Andrews. He was 46 years old, had been with the White Star Line for 21 years, and had served as chief steward of the first-class accommodation on 3 previous Olympic crossings since her maiden voyage in June. He greeted you with the specific warmth that the chief stewards of the great liners had developed for their regular passengers, although you were not yet a regular passenger, and he had only met you once, on the previous westbound crossing in early August, for the few minutes that the boarding process required. He remembered you. He remembered Hortense. He remembered that you had requested your morning tea at 7:30, and that you preferred a hot fresh roll to the cold biscuits that the standard breakfast tray contained. The limited particularity of this institutional memory was, on a great liner, one of the deep, genuine luxuries of first-class travel, and it produced, in the passengers who experienced it, a chosen kind of relaxed gratitude that the more impersonal large hotels of the era did not, on the whole, manage to replicate. Mr. Andrews led you with your mother and sister from the head of the gangway through the first-class entrance on B-Deck and into the central area of the ship's first-class accommodation. The central area of B-Deck, where the first-class entrance opened, was the foot of the grand staircase. And the grand staircase of the Olympic was, in 1911, the single most photographed and most admired piece of interior architecture on any ship afloat. I want to spend a moment with the grand staircase, because the grand staircase is the room that you have, in some indirect way, almost certainly already seen. It is the room from the films of the disaster of the younger sister. It is the room that, in any modern visual rendering of either ship, the camera lingers on for the longest. It is, in its design, one of the most successful pieces of Edwardian commercial interior architecture ever built, and it deserves the deliberate description that we are going to give it now. The staircase ran from D deck up through 5 decks to the boat deck in a continuous architectural unit that the designers had conceived as a single grand interior space, lit from above through a great wrought iron and frosted glass dome that occupied the equivalent of an entire deck level above the top of the staircase itself. The dome admitted natural light during the day and was lit at night by a great electric chandelier of crystal and brass that hung at the centre of it. The staircase itself was panelled in oak, in a thoughtful adaptation of the English country house style of the early 18th century, with the direct classical detailing of the Wren and Hawksmoor school. The balustrade was of bronze and gilt, in a flowing Louis XIV pattern that the designers had borrowed from the staircases of the great French country houses. The carpet on the treads was a deep red. The wall panels above the staircase, on each of the principal landings, contained ornamental clocks in carved oak frames with allegorical figures representing honour and glory crowning time. There was, at the foot of the staircase on B deck, where you are now standing, a single particularly elaborate clock that the marine architects Andrews and Pirrie of Belfast had identified, in the design phase, as the centrepiece of the entire interior scheme. The clock survived the loss of the younger sister in an individual sense. It was photographed many times during the Olympics' long working life, and the listeners who have seen the films of the disaster have in some indirect way seen this same clock or the measured replica of it that the production designers consulted. The whole effect of the grand staircase, when you stood at the foot of it and looked up through 5 decks of carved oak and bronze and gilt to the great dome of glass and iron above, was that of an English country house compressed into a moving structure. It was the country house gentleman's hall translated into the language of the sea. The wealthy passengers who first encountered it in 1911 reported, in their letters and their published accounts, that it produced in them a feeling that the crossing was already, even before the ship had left the dock, a complete success. The staircase was the design statement of the entire ship. The staircase said, with a kind of architectural confidence that has not, in the century since, often been matched in any commercial interior anywhere, that this was a ship in which the passengers who could afford the upper end of first class would be inhabiting for 6 days an environment of considered formal beauty that the better London or New York establishments could not, on land, exceed. Mr. Andrews led you to the lift, which stood in a side alcove off the staircase landing, and which was attended by a young lift boy of about 16 in the white and gold White Star Line uniform. The first-class accommodation had 3 lifts, and they ran continuously between the principal decks throughout the voyage. Lifts on a ship were, in 1911, still a relatively recent innovation. The Olympic and her sister were among the first liners in the world to be fitted with them, and the measured fact of being able to ride from one deck to another in a lift rather than walking the staircase was, for many of the older passengers who remembered the earlier generation of ships, one of the genuine improvements that the new generation of liners had introduced. You took the lift down to your own deck, you were on the same B deck on which you had boarded, and the cabin was a short walk along the corridor, and you and your mother and sister and Mr. Andrews proceeded along the corridor to the door of your cabin, which was open, and from which the sound of Hortense moving inside indicated that the unpacking was well advanced. The cabin into which Mr. Andrews now ushered you was a single outside stateroom on B deck, port side, midships, decorated in the Louis Quinze style. The cabin was perhaps 15 feet long by 10 feet wide, with the minor adjacent bath off the main room, and it was, by the standards of any modern hotel room, a relatively restrained space. By the standards of an ocean-going ship in 1911, it was a model of compressed luxury. The walls were panelled in pale grey wood with the gilded mouldings that the Louis Quinze style required. The bed was set against the inner wall, with a focused carved canopy in pale grey and gold, and was made up with the heavy white linen and the cream silk coverlet that the White Star Line provided in its first-class accommodation. There was a muted writing desk against the outer wall, beneath the porthole, with a chair upholstered in pale rose silk and a single plain electric reading lamp. There was a wardrobe large enough for one of the 4 Vuitton trunks, but not, of course, for all of them, the rest of which had been stowed in the plain luggage room at the end of the corridor. There was a small dressing table with a triple mirror, and the plain array of silver-topped bottles and brushes that Hortense had already arranged from the dressing case. There was a small armchair upholstered in pale rose silk. There was a minor bell pull beside the bed for summoning the cabin steward. The porthole, when you crossed to it and looked out, gave a view down the side of the ship to the New York pier, with the lean bustle of the embarkation continuing below. The porthole was perhaps 18 inches in diameter, set in a brass frame, with a heavy circular brass screw at one side that allowed it to be opened, and a dark velvet curtain that could be drawn across it for privacy. The cabin was surprisingly bright, the August sunlight coming through the porthole and reflecting off the pale grey of the panelling produced, in the straightforward confined space, a quality of soft daylight that the photographs and the engravings of the period did not, on the whole, quite capture. Hortense had, in the hour and a half that she had been aboard, accomplished a substantial portion of the unpacking. The wardrobe trunks had been opened, and the gowns had been hung. The dressing case had been unpacked onto the dressing table. The shoes had been arranged in the plain shoe rack at the foot of the wardrobe. The various accessories of the toilette had been arranged on the dressing table and in the spare drawers of the bedside cabinet. The whole cabin had, in the time before your arrival, been transformed from a beautifully appointed but impersonal stateroom into something that already felt in the notable ways that the attentive arrangement of a personal space produces, like your room. Your books on the small bedside table, your stationery in the desk, your specific brand of bath salts in the bathroom, your minor framed photograph of your husband, taken the previous summer at his family's country house, on the dressing table beside the silver-backed brushes. Hortense, in this quiet skill, was worth every shilling of the considerable wages that you and your husband had agreed to pay her, and the confined, comfortable transformation of the cabin in the space of 90 minutes was one of the lower ongoing demonstrations of why the better Edwardian ladies' maids were, in their profession, considered to be the equal of any servant in any household. Mallers, you and your mother and your sister had perhaps an hour in the cabin before the bell would ring throughout the ship to announce that all visitors must go ashore in preparation for sailing. The hour passed in the deliberate conversation that the parting of close family members in this kind of setting produces. Your mother, who was 61 years old and who had not herself crossed the Atlantic since her honeymoon in 1873, had come aboard the ship with the sort of thoughtful curiosity that the older generation of American women brought to the new generation of liners. She inspected the cabin. She walked along the corridor with you and looked into the writing room and the lounge, which were a short walk forward of your cabin on the same deck. She admired the various minor details of the decoration that the chief steward had pointed out on the private tour that Mr. Andrews had volunteered for the family parties of regular passengers. She told you with the measured warmth that she had developed in the months of your father's illness and the year and a half since his death, that the ship was very fine and that she hoped you would have a comfortable crossing and that you would write to her at every port. Your sister was less restrained. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and possessed of the sort of energetic American curiosity that the second daughters of comfortable Philadelphia families had brought to public life since the time of the founders. She wanted to see everything. She wanted to know about everything. She asked Mr. Andrews when he returned briefly to the cabin to inquire whether you needed anything else before the all-ashore bell, an extensive list of questions about the ship that the chief steward of B-deck handled with the attentive, patient courtesy that his position required. How fast did the ship go? How many crew members were aboard? How long had the cook been employed by the White Star Line? Where did the food come from? What was the largest fish that had ever been caught from one of the ship's lines? Mr. Andrews answered the answerable questions and politely deflected the unanswerable ones, and your sister, by the time the all-ashore bell rang at 11:45, had accumulated enough information about the Olympic to write the limited comic letter to her remaining sister at home that the conversation in the cabin had been, in part, designed to produce. The all-ashore bell rang at 11:45. The chief steward returned to the cabin to escort your visitors to the gangway. You walked them through the corridor to the staircase, and from the staircase down to the entry on B-deck where you had come aboard, and you embraced your mother and your sister at the head of the gangway in the deliberate kiss-and-hold that family farewells of this kind required. Your mother said that she would write. Your sister said that she would write. You said, with the bright tone that the actual departure of a wished-for journey produces, that you would write also. You stood at the head of the gangway and watched them walk back down the covered passage to the pier shed, and you waved, and they waved, and at the door of the shed they turned and waved a final time, and the limited group of them disappeared into the bustle of the boarding day. You returned to the cabin. Hortense had finished the unpacking. The cabin was finally ready. You had perhaps 15 minutes before noon, when the ship was scheduled to sail, and you decided to use the 15 minutes to go up to the boat deck to watch the departure. The boat deck of the Olympic was the topmost passenger deck of the ship, the deck on which the lifeboats were stowed in their davits along the sides, and on which the first-class passengers took their longest promenade. The first-class section of the boat deck ran for nearly 500 feet, from the bridge structure forward to the rear funnel area aft, and a complete circuit of the first-class boat deck 4 times round was approximately equal to a mile. The walking of the boat deck was, by the rituals of a long crossing, one of the standard daily activities of the first-class passenger, and you would, by the end of your 6 days, walk perhaps 80 miles along it. For the moment, however, you were going up not to walk, but to find a place at the rail to watch the ship leave New York. You went up by the lift. You came out onto the boat deck through the slender entrance from the staircase, which delivered you onto the open promenade just aft of the second funnel. The deck was crowded with passengers and waving relatives and the underlying last-minute bustle of departure. The crew was completing the last of the boarding tasks. The lines that held the ship to the pier were being made ready to be cast off. The 4 great funnels above you were beginning, for the first time since your boarding, to issue the unadorned dark wisps of coal smoke that indicated that the boilers below decks were being brought to the operating pressure that the departure required. There was in the air of the boat deck on a sailing day in 1911 an individual quality of held expectation that no other moment of the sea voyage produced. The ship was about to leave. The harbour beyond the pier was sunlit. The 120,000 horsepower of the engines below decks was, for the first time, beginning to be brought to its full strength. At precisely 12 noon, the deep rumble of the ship's whistle began. The whistle of the Olympic was the deepest and loudest whistle in the world. It was operated by steam from the boilers. It sounded a notable banked note that could be heard from 20 miles out at sea, on a still day, and it produced, on the boat deck of the ship herself when it sounded, a vibration in the air that you could feel in your chest as well as hear in your ears. The whistle sounded 3 times. The lines were cast off. 2 plain tugs at the bow of the ship took the strain and began to ease her out into the Hudson River. The departure of a great liner from a New York pier was, in 1911, one of the most spectacular events that the New York waterfront had to offer, and it was watched not only by the family parties on the pier, but by perhaps several hundred ordinary spectators who had gathered along the waterfront on either side of the pier to see the ship leave. There was a minor flotilla of harbour craft along her sides. As she emerged from the pier, there were the unshowy whistles and bells of the harbour traffic acknowledging her departure. There was, from the boat deck on which you stood, the specific moment in which the long black side of the ship cleared the end of the pier and the engines began to turn, slowly at first, and then with increasing confidence, and the ship began, for the first time, to move under her own power. The Manhattan waterfront, when the ship had moved out into the river and begun to turn south for the run down to the Narrows, was extraordinary. The ship moved at perhaps 8 knots through the harbour, in the thoughtful navigation that the harbour traffic required, and the buildings of lower Manhattan slid past in the bright August sun. The new Singer Building, completed 3 years earlier, and the tallest building in the world at the time of its completion, was visible. The Woolworth Building was rising in steel, its skeleton already at perhaps 30 stories of what would, in the following year, be 60. The forest of slightly older skyscrapers that lined the waterfront from the Battery up to 20th Street stood in the morning sun. You stood at the rail and watched. The ship continued south. The Statue of Liberty came into view to starboard on her small island in the harbour, and the ship passed her at a distance of perhaps half a mile, and the people on the boat deck waved at the statue in the minor ritual gesture that crossings beginning at New York had developed over the previous quarter century. The statue, of course, did not wave back. The Statue of Liberty was in 1911 25 years old, having been dedicated in 1886, and she had become in the quarter century since one of the tight, fixed icons of the New York harbour for the eastbound traveller. You watched her recede. The ship continued through the Narrows, between the headlands of Brooklyn and Staten Island, and out into the lower bay, where the harbour pilot would, in due course, be transferred to a squat cutter that would meet the ship and take him back to New York. The transfer of the harbour pilot was the final formal act of the harbour departure. After the pilot was off, the ship was, in a specific technical sense, at sea. The captain on the bridge gave the engines their full power. The ship began slowly to gather speed. The Hudson and the harbour fell behind. The horizon ahead opened up into the empty grey-blue of the North Atlantic, and the ship, which had until this moment been a very large object in a confined harbour, began to become what she had been built to be, which was a moving creature in her natural element, with the long, slow, deep movements of a 6-day Atlantic crossing now beginning to settle into the rhythm of her hull as she headed eastward toward the open ocean. You stood at the rail for perhaps another half hour. The land of Long Island fell behind to the north. The land of New Jersey fell behind to the south. The ship was finally out at sea. The wind on the boat deck, which had been the warm August harbour air on the way out, was now becoming the cooler Atlantic wind that the open ocean produced even in late summer. You drew the basic woolen wrap that you had brought up with you more closely round your shoulders. You watched the wake of the ship spreading out behind her in 2 long curving lines of white foam against the grey-blue of the sea. You felt, in the slight gentle motion of the deck beneath your feet, the first plain registration of the swell of the Atlantic, the long subdued rolling motion that would, over the coming 6 days, become the constant unconscious accompaniment of every meal and every conversation and every period of sleep. You were at sea. You went back down to the cabin. Hortense had laid out the costume for the first lunch on board, which would be served in the dining saloon at 1 o'clock, and for which a day dress was the standard midday costume of the era. A soft tea gown in pale silver-grey silk, with neat lace at the throat and the cuffs, the sort of relatively informal first-class lunch costume that the daytime dining saloon required. You changed. You did the small adjustment to your hair that the morning's wind on the boat deck had necessitated. You picked up the minor enamelled card case that contained your visiting cards, in the unlikely event that the lunch should produce an introduction that required them, and you went forward along the corridor to the staircase, and down by the staircase to D-deck, where the first-class dining saloon occupied the entire midsection of the ship's main deck. The first-class dining saloon of the Olympic was, in 1911, the largest single room afloat. It was 114 feet long. It was 92 feet wide. It could seat 532 passengers in a single sitting. It was decorated in what the marine architects had described as the Jacobean style, the 17th century English manor house style of carved oak panelling, with white painted plaster ceilings in elaborate moulded patterns, and with the heavy oak chairs and tables that the Jacobean style required. The room was, in its first impression, on a passenger entering it for the first time, the size and the gravity and the formal completeness of the great hall of an English country house. The walls were oak, the ceiling was white, the floor was covered with the deep blue and red carpet that the White Star Line had commissioned specially for the room. The chandeliers were brass and crystal, hung at intervals along the length of the saloon, lit by the new electric light that had only recently begun to replace the older gas lighting in the great public rooms of liners. There was a limited alcove at the far end of the saloon in which a deep string trio performed during meals. 3 musicians in the green White Star Line uniform, playing the sort of light classical and popular music that the dining of a great Edwardian liner required. You were shown to your table by the dining saloon steward, a man called Mr. Holloway, who had been on the Olympic since her maiden voyage in June, and who had developed, in the months since, the measured institutional memory of his profession. Your table was a brief table for 4 passengers on the starboard side of the saloon, in the middle row of tables that ran the length of the room. The other 3 passengers at your table had not yet arrived, the seating having been arranged on the standard White Star principle that the dining saloon stewards would, on the basis of attentive reading of the passenger list and a private system of assessment, place compatible parties at the same tables for the duration of the crossing. The system was not infallible, and there were stories of dining saloon stewards who had placed incompatible parties together with consequences that had, in the worst cases, become plain legendary stories of the New York to Southampton run. But the system was, in the great majority of cases, surprisingly successful, and the tiny tables of 4 to 6 passengers that the dining saloon assembled were, for the duration of the crossing, the social units around which the social life of the ship organized itself. Before we begin to meet your table, I should give you some sense of the midday meal that the Olympic dining saloon was about to produce. The meal in question was lunch, which on the great Edwardian liners was a more substantial affair than the modern reader may immediately suppose, but was less elaborate than the formal dinners of the evening. The standard first-class lunch on the Olympic was a buffet of cold dishes accompanied by 2 or 3 hot options, and concluded by a measured dessert and cheese. The buffet, which ran the length of one side of the room on a substantial table draped in heavy white damask, contained, on a typical day, somewhere between 40 and 50 different dishes. There was roast beef, roast lamb, roast turkey, ham, tongue, roast pheasant in season, roast partridge in season, roast duckling, and roast chicken, all set out for slicing. There were salmon and lobster with oysters on ice. There were pies, pates, galantines, mousses, and the salads that such a table required. The hot dishes were generally 3 or 4, 1 or 2 roasts, and 1 or 2 more elaborate preparations that the chef had decided to feature on that specific day. The desserts ran to perhaps 10 options, the cheeses to perhaps 15. The fresh fruit, of which the Olympic carried an almost incredible quantity in her refrigerated holds, was always available. The wine list at lunch was the same as the wine list at dinner, although the typical first-class passenger ordered considerably less of it at the midday meal than at the evening one. Your fellow passengers at the table arrived in the staggered way that the lunch hour produced. The first to arrive was an English gentleman of perhaps 50, who was returning home from a business visit to New York. He introduced himself with the deliberate brevity that English gentlemen of the era brought to the introductions of strangers in the dining saloons of Atlantic liners. His name, he said, was Holland. He was a director of one of the larger shipping insurance firms in the city of London. He had been in New York for the past 3 weeks examining certain accounts of the firm's American agents. He was now returning home to his family in Surrey for the rest of the summer. The introduction took perhaps 30 seconds. He was unfailingly polite, slightly reserved, and you could see, in the thoughtful way that you had developed over 3 years of marriage to an Englishman, that he was the sort of man whose companionship at meals would be agreeable but never confidential. The second to arrive was an elderly American widow of perhaps 70, travelling alone, who introduced herself as Mrs. Harrington of Boston, and who was, she said, going to England to visit her granddaughter who had married an English clergyman the previous year, and who was about to have her first child. Mrs. Harrington had crossed the Atlantic 11 times in her life. She had a chosen fondness for the White Star Line, she said, because her late husband had been the New York agent for the line for the closing decade of his career, and she had received every year of her widowhood since his death in 1903 a focused cabin upgrade as a courtesy of the company. The third to arrive, just as the steward was beginning to bring the first plates from the buffet, was a young American woman of perhaps 26. She was travelling alone, she said. Her name was Miss Worthington of Chicago. She was on her way to spend a year studying piano in Vienna with an individual Austrian teacher whose name she mentioned, and which, although you did not recognize it, both Mrs. Harrington and Mr. Holland appeared to recognize. Miss Worthington was the daughter of a Chicago industrialist whose name you did recognize, and she was, in the measured way that the very wealthy daughters of American industrialists conducted themselves in this period, slightly more reserved than her circumstances would have permitted her to be. The 4 of you, then, were the table for the crossing: an English insurance director returning home, a Boston widow visiting her granddaughter, a Chicago heiress on her way to Vienna, and you, the young American wife of an English diplomat returning to her husband. The composition of the table was, as Mr. Holloway, the dining saloon steward, had no doubt calculated, a balanced one. There would be enough common ground for conversation. There would not be the sort of pointed political or social difference that would make the conversation uncomfortable. The 4 of you would, for the next 6 days, take all of your meals together, unless one of you opted out for a notable reason, and the direct social geography of the table would, over the course of the crossing, develop into one of the plain structures of the daily life on the ship. The lunch was not the elaborate ritual of the dinner. It was by the standards of a wealthy American or English household on land, a more substantial midday meal than the women of either country would generally serve at home, but it was relatively informal in its conduct. You went to the buffet. You selected what you wanted. You returned to the table with your plate. The dining saloon steward, who hovered at the appropriate discreet distance, kept the table supplied with bread and butter and water and wine. You and your fellow passengers ate at your own pace. You spoke to one another in the attentive way that the first lunch of a 6-day crossing required, in the sort of conversation that established the initial parameters of the social relationship that the four of you were now beginning. Mr. Holland told a minor anecdote about the New York hotel at which he had been staying. Mrs. Harrington reminisced briefly about her late husband and the early days of his association with the line. Miss Worthington described her impressions of the ship's appointments, which she had been examining with the specific attention that a wealthy young woman travelling alone for the first time will bring to her surroundings. You contributed your own restrained portions of conversation. The lunch took perhaps an hour and a quarter. The string trio in the alcove played at plain volume throughout. The whole experience was the deliberate, pleasant assembly of a lean, temporary society that the Atlantic crossing had been creating, with minor variations, for the previous 3/4 of a century, and that the Olympic in 1911 had elevated to a chosen Edwardian perfection. After lunch, you returned to your cabin for the muted period of rest that the early afternoon of a crossing day required. The first day at sea was by the practice of the experienced crosser, generally a quieter day than the days that followed it, the sort of day in which the new passenger settled gradually into the rhythm of the ship and adjusted to the individual conditions of life at sea. You changed out of the lunch costume and into a soft silk wrapper. You lay on the bed. The motion of the ship, now that she was at full cruising speed and out into the open ocean, was a long, slow, gentle roll, the sort of motion that the experienced traveller quickly learned to find soothing rather than disturbing, and that the inexperienced traveller took perhaps a day to adjust to. You were not, on this your 4th crossing, an inexperienced traveller. The motion settled you. You closed your eyes. You allowed yourself, for an hour and a half, the private rest that the long crossing made possible, and that the city life on either side of the ocean did not, on the whole, encourage. When you woke, the cabin was in the quieter light of the late afternoon. The August sun was now slanting in through the porthole at a lower angle. The motion of the ship had settled, in the time of your sleep, into the steady rhythm that you would now experience continuously for the next 5 days. You rang for Hortense. She came. She helped you out of the wrapper and into the late afternoon costume that the standard tea hour required. A slightly more formal day dress in pale lavender silk with a small lace fichu at the throat. The afternoon tea on the Olympic was served in 2 locations. The reception room on D-deck, just outside the dining saloon, was the more formal of the two, and was where the older passengers and the gentlemen tended to take their tea. The veranda cafe on A-deck, with its trelliside ironwork and its climbing greenery and its outlook over the boat deck and the sea beyond, was the more fashionable of the two, and was where the younger first-class passengers tended to gather. You went, on this first afternoon, to the veranda cafe. I want to spend a moment with the veranda cafe, because the veranda cafe was one of the genuine architectural inventions of the Olympic and her sister, and it represented, in its design, one of the more interesting attempts that the Edwardian era had made at producing, on a moving ship, an interior space that imitated the open garden conservatory of an English country house. The veranda occupied 2 small rooms at the rear of the boat deck superstructure, one on the port side and one on the starboard side, with the rear of each room opening through tall arched windows onto the boat deck. The interior of each veranda was decorated in white-painted wrought ironwork, in the pattern of a flowering trellis, with real climbing greenery ivy, predominantly and flowering vines trained up the trellis. The ceiling was painted to suggest the open sky of a summer's day. The floor was tiled in pale stone in a minor geometric pattern. The chairs were white wicker, with cushions in pale green and pale rose. The tables were confined round wicker, with tops of beaten copper. The whole effect, when you stepped into the veranda from the corridor, was that of stepping from the interior of a ship into the underlying enclosed garden of a country house, with the climbing plants and the wicker furniture and the soft afternoon light, and the plain bonus of being able to see, through the tall arched windows, the open sea beyond. The orchestra played in the veranda cafe in the afternoon. The orchestra of the Olympic in 1911 was a 5-piece ensemble: a violin, a cello, a viola, a piano, and a double bass, and its members rotated, in shifts, across the various rooms in which afternoon and evening music was provided. The bandmaster on this notable crossing was an Englishman called Wallace Hartley, a violinist from Yorkshire who had been with the White Star Line for some years, and who would, in the plain unkind way that history sometimes singles out specific individuals, transfer to the Titanic for her maiden voyage the following April, and become, in the manner of his death there, one of the spare permanent legends of the disaster. Hartley was, on the August afternoon we are describing, the leader of the limited ensemble that was now playing in the veranda cafe where you had taken your seat at a small wicker table near the tall arched windows, a quiet selection of light classical pieces. There was a minor Strauss waltz. There was a piece from Gilbert and Sullivan. There was a short Brahms intermezzo. There was a brief excerpt from one of the more popular American musical comedies of the previous winter. The whole effect, with the soft afternoon light and the climbing greenery and the slender tea things and the Atlantic visible through the windows, was one of the banked chosen pleasures of the Olympic crossing, and you would, in the days that followed, return to the veranda cafe for tea every afternoon of the voyage. The tea itself was the standard elaborate tea of an Edwardian first-class establishment. The straightforward silver tray on which it arrived contained a plain silver teapot, a small silver hot water jug, an unshowy jug of milk, a brief bowl of sugar, a thin slice of lemon on a small saucer, 2 tiny cups and saucers in the White Star pattern of white porcelain, with the cobalt blue burgee and the red White Star flag at the rim. The food was on the standard tiered cake stand of the era, with the tight finger sandwiches on the bottom tier, the scones with their squat dishes of cream and jam in the middle tier, and the unadorned pastries and miniature cakes on the top tier. You took tea alone. You ate the plain sandwiches and a single scone and a small chocolate eclair. You drank 2 cups of the tea. You watched the Atlantic through the tall arched windows. The light on the sea, as the August afternoon began to advance toward evening, was the individual long gold light of an open ocean horizon late in a fine summer day, and it produced, in the neat enclosed garden of the veranda, the sort of half-lit late afternoon atmosphere that no shore-based establishment could quite reproduce, because no shore-based establishment had the moving horizon and the unbroken expanse of sea outside its windows. You were back in your cabin at 6 o'clock, in good time for the evening dressing. The evening dressing, on a great Edwardian liner, was the most considered and most elaborate dressing of the wealthy traveller's day. The first-class dinner aboard a liner of this generation was, in its formality, the equal of any private dinner that the wealthy of London or New York would attend on land. The men dressed in white tie and tails, the women dressed in full evening costume, with the elaborate gowns and the considerable jewellery that the formal evening required. The dressing for dinner began at 6. Dinner was served at 7. The dressing took, accordingly, a full hour, sometimes longer. Hortense, in the time of the afternoon, had been preparing the components of the evening costume. There was the bath which she drew while you were taking tea in the adjoining bathroom. There was the sequence of underclothes, the silk chemise, the long corset that the evening gown required, the corset cover, the lightweight silk petticoats, the silk stockings in the pale flesh tone that the evening fashion of 1911 required. There were the evening shoes, minor subdued-heeled satin slippers in cream with limited embroidered rosettes at the front. There was the gown itself. The gown for the first dinner was one that you and your dressmaker had agreed, in the discussions before the crossing, would be the most generally suitable of the 4 evening gowns you had brought with you. It was a Lucille gown, made in London the previous April, in pale dove-grey satin with overlay of cream lace, with the long sweeping skirt of the era, the soft décolletage of the bust that the formal evening dinner required, and the deep short sleeves of cream lace. The Lucille workshop in London was, as I have mentioned in another connection on another evening, the most fashionable couturier in England, and the gown was the sort of gown that a young Englishwoman of fashion would have considered entirely appropriate for the first dinner on a fashionable crossing. The jewellery for the evening was a triple strand of pearls with matching pearl earrings and bracelet that your husband had given you on the 3rd anniversary of your wedding the previous April. The hair was dressed in the standard pompadour arrangement, with the addition of a basic spray of artificial cream silk roses at the back. The wrap, for the brief journey along the corridor and down the staircase, was a cream silk crepe wrap with embroidered borders. The whole assembly took, from the bath to the moment when you stood, finally, in front of the long mirror in the plain adjacent dressing area for Hortense's final inspection, exactly 55 minutes. You were dressed for the dinner. The bugler was due to begin sounding through the corridors at 5 minutes to 7, in the notable ritual that the White Star Line had developed for the summoning of first-class passengers to dinner. The bugler, a young man in the White Star uniform with a brass bugle, walked the corridors of B decks playing the same small piece of music every evening, a tune that the line had borrowed from the old English ballad of the roast beef of Old England, on the measured grounds that the old ballad's cheerful association with the great English meal was an appropriate accompaniment to the announcement of the great White Star Line dinner. You heard the bugle, distantly at first and then closer, as Hortense was making the final adjustments to the small spray of roses in your hair. You stepped out of the cabin, with Hortense holding the door for you. You walked along the corridor in the minor sweep of your gown to the staircase, and from the staircase down to D deck, where the reception room outside the dining saloon was beginning to fill with the first-class passengers in their full evening costume. The reception room of the Olympic was the focused public room directly outside the entrance to the first-class dining saloon, and it functioned as the gathering place for the dinner. The reception room was decorated in the same Jacobean oak panelling as the dining saloon itself, with white-painted plaster mouldings on the ceiling and a deep red carpet on the floor. The room contained perhaps 24 muted armchairs and direct settees, arranged in the plain conversational groupings that the room's function required, and a single side alcove at one end in which a piano stood, and on which the orchestra trio that played in the room before dinner had its place. The room was, when you entered it shortly before 7, perhaps 2/3 full. There were perhaps 150 first-class passengers in the room, in the full splendour of their evening dress, in the specific kind of restrained gathering that no shore-based establishment ever quite produced. The men were in white tie and tails. The women were in full evening gowns of every fashionable cut, with jewellery whose collective valuation, if it had been calculated, would have run easily to a sum of several £1,000,000. The orchestra was playing. The waiters were circulating with small trays of sherry and minor canapés. The chief steward was at the door of the dining saloon, holding the seating book, ready to direct the passengers to their tables when the dining saloon doors were finally opened. It was in the reception room on this first evening that you saw, for the first time, the gentleman who would become one of the lean recurring presences of your crossing. He was standing on the far side of the room, near the entrance to the dining saloon, with two younger men in evening dress at either elbow, who were clearly his secretaries or his personal aides. He was of medium height, heavily built, with white hair brushed back from his forehead, and the most famous nose in American commerce, large, bulbous, scarred by the disease called rhinophyma, that had disfigured his face since middle age, and that he had refused with characteristic obstinacy to allow any photographer to retouch. He was John Pierpont Morgan. He was 74 years old in this late summer of 1911. He was the most powerful private financier in the world. He had, in the spectacular sequence of corporate consolidations that the previous decade had produced, organized the United States Steel Corporation in 1901, financed the formation of General Electric, controlled most of the American railroad system through his banking interests, and in 1902 brought together the great Atlantic shipping lines into the trust called the International Mercantile Marine, which controlled, among other lines, the White Star Line, which owned the ship on which you are now standing. He owned the ship, or his trust did, which in 1911 came to the same thing. The Olympic was, in some real but indirect sense, his ship. He had, on board the Olympic, a permanent reservation, the two parlour suites on B deck, the £870 suites, the most expensive accommodation on any ship in the world, were held available to him on every Atlantic crossing he wished to take. He used them several times a year. He had, on this crossing, taken up the starboard parlour suite in the company of his two secretaries and a personal physician who had been travelling with him in recent years. He was on his way to Europe for the autumn season, which he generally spent at his various establishments in London and Paris and at the spa town of Aix-les-Bains in the French Alps. He would die in Rome in March 1913, 18 months from the August evening on which you saw him for the first time in the reception room of the Olympic. He did not, of course, know that he had 18 months to live. He looked on the evening in question in the way that the photographs of him in the period reliably show him, slightly weary, slightly preoccupied, and entirely magnificent. You did not, on this first evening, speak to him. He was a public figure of a kind that the reception rooms of Atlantic liners regularly produced, and the lower protocol of such rooms permitted the ordinary first-class passengers to recognize the famous figures present without actively introducing themselves. He was pointed out to you by Mrs. Harrington, who had come down to dinner separately, and who was now standing at your elbow with the quiet pride of an older Boston widow who recognized a New York financier on sight. "He has aged," Mrs. Harrington said. "He looks tired. The two younger men with him are his new secretaries. The previous senior secretary died last year. There has been a plain reorganization of his affairs." Mrs. Harrington produced this information with the particular accuracy of a Boston widow whose husband had been involved in the New York shipping world, and who continued in her widowhood to follow the careers of the major figures of that world with attention. You absorbed the information. You looked for a thoughtful moment at the great man on the far side of the room, and then, with the social discipline that the reception room required, you turned back to Mrs. Harrington, and the conversation continued. The dining saloon doors opened at 7:05. The chief steward began directing the passengers to their tables. You and Mrs. Harrington made your way through the narrow bottleneck at the door and into the great room itself, which was now lit at full brilliance, with the chandeliers above the tables glowing, and the silver and the crystal on the tables catching the light in the sort of glittering accumulation that the dining saloons of great liners reliably produced. And you took your seats at the table where Mr. Holland and Miss Worthington were already waiting. The first dinner of the crossing had begun. The dinner that the chef of the Olympic produced on this first evening was the standard first evening dinner of a major Atlantic crossing. It ran to 9 courses. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes from the first to the last. It was accompanied by a sequence of carefully chosen wines, each appropriate to its course, in the minor ritual progression that the formal dinner of the era had developed. The chef of the Olympic was a Frenchman called Henri Jaillet, who had been recruited by the White Star Line from one of the better London hotels, and who brought to the kitchens of the Olympic a notable Anglo-French culinary sensibility that the menus of the line had been adapting to for the past several years. The kitchens themselves, which lay below the dining saloon on a separate deck, were the most elaborate kitchens afloat. They occupied a substantial section of D deck. They contained the main galley, the bakery, the pastry kitchen, the sauces section, the cold larder, the pantries, the storerooms, and the specific installations that the great quantities of meat and fish and game and dairy and vegetables required for the feeding of 2,000 passengers and 900 crew across a 6-day voyage demanded. The Olympic carried on each crossing somewhere in the region of 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 11,000 pounds of fresh fish, 40,000 fresh eggs, 10,000 pounds of sugar, and somewhere upwards of 25,000 bottles of beer and wine and spirits. The chef's brigade in the kitchen ran to about 60 cooks at various ranks, working in shifts, and a further support staff of perhaps twice that number in the various pantries and washing-up areas. The whole apparatus, when it was considered as a single organised system, was roughly equivalent to the kitchens of an underlying grand hotel transplanted onto a ship. The first course on this opening evening was hors d'oeuvres varies, served in individual portions on the individual hors d'oeuvres plates that the dining saloon's china service included. There was a plain portion of caviar on a limited piece of toast. There was a limited portion of smoked salmon. There was a small piece of pâté de foie gras. There was a small portion of marinated mushrooms in oil. There was a small piece of anchovy on toast. The wine for the first course was a dry sherry. Mr. Holloway, the dining saloon steward, presented the bottle to the table at the appropriate moment, poured a spare taste for whichever of the gentlemen was acting as the social leader of the table, and on receipt of the brief approving nod that the wine ritual required, he poured a small glass for each of the 3 other diners. The second course was the consommé, which on the Olympic was the chosen preparation called consommé Olga, a clear beef and veal broth flavoured with port wine and garnished with minor pieces of poached sturgeon roe. The consommé was followed by the fish course, which on this first evening was poached salmon with a mousseline sauce, the salmon having been brought aboard fresh from the Hudson River markets the previous afternoon, and the mousseline sauce being an individual elaboration of the hollandaise that the chef Henri Jaillet had developed as one of his signature preparations. The wine with the fish was a dry white Burgundy, a Meursault from the previous vintage, served chilled. The fish course was followed by the entree, which on the standard 9-course progression was a confined course of meat in a sauce, served in individual portions of moderate size. On this evening it was a banked filet mignon lily, the straightforward medallion of beef on a round of artichoke bottom with a plain slice of foie gras and a sauce of truffles and Madeira. The wine with the entree was a young claret, a Pauillac from a recent vintage. The entree was followed by the sorbet, which functioned as the brief palate-cleansing pause in the middle of the dinner on this evening, an unshowy punch romaine, a half-frozen sorbet of rum and white wine and lemon and orange, served in small-footed glasses with small silver spoons. The sorbet marked, in the rhythm of the meal, the transition from the lighter early courses to the more substantial main courses of the dinner. The next course was the roast, on this evening a roast saddle of lamb with mint sauce, accompanied by buttered new potatoes and creamed spinach. The wine with the roast was an older claret, a Saint Julien from a vintage 7 years previous. The roast was followed by the game course. On this evening, a roast squab on toast with a watercress salad. The game was followed by the cold dish. On this evening, a cold course of asparagus vinaigrette. The cold dish was followed by the sweet course. On this evening, a slender confection that the chef called Waldorf pudding, a squat steamed sponge with apple and walnut and a Calvados sauce. The wine with the sweet was a sauterne. The dinner concluded with the cheese on the standard cheese board of perhaps 15 cheeses, and with the unadorned dessert of fresh fruit and plain petits fours. The whole sequence took, as I have said, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 hours. The conversation at the table proceeded, throughout, at the pace that the courses set for it. There was a quarter of an hour to an hour over each course, depending on the elaborateness of the dish. There was the ritual of the wine being poured for each course, the neat examination of it by whichever of the gentlemen was leading the table at that moment, the pleasant murmur of approval, the minor filling of the 4 glasses. There was the tight conversation that progressed from the slightly stilted introductions of the early courses to the warmer and easier exchanges of the later ones. By the cheese, you and Mr. Holland were exchanging the sort of comfortable observations about the state of the world that the 4 of you would, by the closing days of the crossing, settle into as a kind of subdued social rhythm. By the dessert, Miss Worthington had told you the measured story of her piano teacher in Vienna, and the private hopes she had for the year of study ahead, and Mrs. Harrington had told the table the tiny comic anecdote about her late husband's first crossing of the Atlantic in 1872, that she would, you suspected, tell the table again in some slightly varied form on at least 2 further occasions of the voyage. The dinner ended at 9:20. The first-class passengers, in the measured scattered movement that the post-dinner period produced, dispersed through the various public rooms of the ship. The gentlemen, as I have mentioned, retired to the smoking room on a deck. The ladies and the younger members of the company, and a smaller proportion of the gentlemen who preferred mixed company to the brandy and cigars, moved to the lounge. The lounge of the Olympic was the principal mixed company room of the first-class accommodation, and it was, in its decoration, one of the more impressive single rooms on the ship. The lounge was decorated in the Louis Quinze style, the same 18th century French taste that several of the parlour suites had been done in, and that I have already described in connection with your own cabin. The lounge was, however, the lounge writ large, and the intimate French taste of the bedroom cabin became, in the great lounge, a much more substantial architectural statement. The walls were panelled in carved white-painted wood, with the minor gilded mouldings of the period, and the ceiling was painted with a limited allegorical scheme of pale gold and pale blue that the marine architects had commissioned from a notable London decorative artist. The chairs were upholstered in the soft pale green and pale rose silks that the Louis Quinze taste required. There was a substantial fireplace at one end of the room, purely decorative, of course, since open fires on a ship were not permitted, but with the deep, subtle electric arrangement that produced the effect of a banked fire glowing in the grate. And above the fireplace there was a specific, elaborate gilded clock and mirror combination. The room was lit in the evening by a series of crystal chandeliers and by the smaller table lamps that were placed at intervals on the basic writing tables and side tables along the walls. The whole effect was that of a French 18th century salon. The orchestra played in the lounge after dinner. The plain ensemble that had played the dinner music in the reception room and the dining saloon now reassembled in the lounge, in a side alcove at the far end of the room, and played a quieter and more carefully chosen selection of music for the after-dinner period. There was a Schubert quartet. There was a restrained selection from Mendelssohn. There was a selection from one of the recent Edward German light operatic productions that had been popular in London during the previous winter. The volume was kept muted in the attentive etiquette of the after-dinner lounge, so that the music was a presence rather than the principal entertainment, and the conversation in the room could continue without competition. You took coffee in the lounge, with Mrs. Harrington and Miss Worthington and several other passengers from the surrounding tables in the dining saloon, in the deliberate expansion of the table groupings that the lounge facilitated. The conversation was light. The cigars in the smoking room across the corridor produced in the minor currents of air through the doorways the faint, distant smell of fine tobacco that the gentlemen's quarters of the era reliably produced. You stayed in the lounge for perhaps an hour after dinner. You drank 1 cup of coffee and refused a second. You allowed yourself, with Miss Worthington, the focused conversation about Vienna and music and the lower hopes of the year ahead that the young woman had not, before this evening, had occasion to discuss with anyone since boarding. You ended the conversation at 10:15, when the gradual emptying of the lounge made it clear that the regular early bedtime of the first night of a crossing was being observed by the majority of the passengers. You went, before bed, for a turn on the boat deck. The night air on the open ocean in late August is a chosen thing. It has the cleanness of air that has crossed several thousand miles of empty sea. It is cold, in the way that even a summer sea air can be cold when the wind is moving across it at 15 knots, and there are no buildings or trees or land masses in any direction to break the wind. It carries the direct distant smell of the salt water and the individual plain smell of the ship herself, the coal smoke from the funnels, the warm machine smell from the ventilators, the soft scent of the pine and oil that the crew used for the polishing of the brass and the deck. The night sky over an open ocean is a sky that the modern reader has perhaps never seen. There are no city lights. There are no shore lights for hundreds of miles in any direction. The stars are present, in their full unblocked Atlantic clarity, in numbers that the inhabitant of any modern lit-up city has long since forgotten was the natural condition of the night. You walked briefly the length of the boat deck on the starboard side, with the plane wrap pulled tightly around your shoulders, and you stood for a moment at the rail at the rear of the deck, looking back along the wake of the ship as it stretched out behind into the darkness, with the silver phosphorescence that the disturbed water of the wake reliably produced, and with the great track of stars overhead, and you allowed yourself the private moment of the first night at sea that the experienced crosser learned, after the first or second voyage, to expect and to welcome. You were, for a moment, alone with the Atlantic. The ship behind you had become, in the lean, distinct way that a great liner can, an underlying floating community of its own. The land behind and the land ahead were equally distant. The night sea around you was, in the strict sense of the word, empty. The whole of the world that mattered for the next 5 nights was the ship herself and the people on her, and you were now, after the plain effort of the first day, properly aboard. You went down to the cabin. Hortense was waiting for the undressing. The undressing took the standard half-hour that the evening's elaborate dressing required to reverse, with the thoughtful putting away of the gown and the jewellery, and the slow letting down of the hair and the plain wash and the brushing of the teeth, and the changing into the soft lawn nightgown. The bed had been turned down by the cabin steward in the period after dinner. The small reading lamp beside the bed had been switched on. The motion of the ship at this moment, the long, slow, gentle roll of the open Atlantic at night, settled into the notable sleeping rhythm that experienced crossers learn to find more restful than any bed on land. You got into bed, you read for 10 minutes, you turned out the lamp, you closed your eyes. The rhythm of the engines, deep below the cabin, was a constant banked presence that the ear quickly learned to incorporate into the general background of the night. The hum of the ventilation, the distant occasional low creak of the hull as the swell shifted under her, the sense of being carried eastward through the dark at 21 knots, toward a horizon that you would not see again for another 5 days. You slept. The morning came. The morning of the second day at sea is the morning at which the experienced crosser first wakes into the rhythm that will define the rest of the voyage. The body has, by the second morning, adjusted to the motion of the ship. The mind has, by the second morning, accepted the minor fact that the city behind is gone, and the city ahead is several days away, and that the present is, until further notice, the ship. The whole quality of consciousness on a ship at sea, on the second morning of a crossing, is a specific quality that no other situation in modern life quite produces. It is the quality of having finally nothing to do. You woke at 7:30. The cabin was lit by the soft morning light coming through the porthole. You rang for Hortense, who came almost immediately, in the confined, efficient way that the better ladies' maids on a crossing managed their morning duties. The cabin steward had brought at the time of the bell the squat early morning tea on the straightforward silver tray with the plain hot fresh roll that you preferred. You drank the tea, you ate the roll, you read for 10 minutes the spare printed daily ship's bulletin that had been slipped under your cabin door overnight. The ship's bulletin was a limited typed sheet that the Marconi room produced each night, summarizing the wireless news that had been received from various shore stations and from other ships at sea in the previous 12 hours. There was the news that Mr. Andrew Bonar Law had been considering whether to stand for the Conservative leadership in the autumn parliamentary session. There was the news that the Persian Cossack Brigade had, in some chosen incident in Tehran, been involved in some brief clash with some notable group of constitutional reformers. There was the news that the test match at the Oval between England and Australia had ended in a draw on the previous afternoon. There was an unshowy piece of news about the new Wright biplane that had been demonstrated at a flying meeting in France. There was at the bottom of the bulletin the daily summary of the ship's progress. At noon yesterday, the ship had been at a specific latitude and a chosen longitude, having travelled 492 nautical miles in the previous 24 hours, which is the standard daily run of an Olympic crossing in normal conditions. You bathed, in the slender adjacent bathroom, in the warm fresh water that the ship's distillation plant produced from seawater. The seawater bath option, which the ship also offered for those who preferred it on the subdued theory of marine hygiene that the era's better doctors had developed, you continued, on this crossing as on previous ones, to decline. You dressed for the morning, in a tailored walking suit in pale grey wool with an unadorned silk blouse beneath the jacket, in the sort of standard morning costume that the daytime decks of the Olympic in late August required. You took your morning constitutional on the boat deck. The morning constitutional was the standard morning activity of the first-class passenger on a great liner. The boat deck of the Olympic, as I have mentioned, allowed for a circuit of approximately a quarter of a mile, and the better-conditioned passengers walked 4 or even 6 circuits in the morning. The deck was, in the time of the morning constitutional, considerably more populated than at any other hour of the day. There were perhaps 100 passengers in motion along the deck at any given moment between 9:30 and 11, in the measured procession of walkers in their morning dress, with the deck stewards in their navy blue uniforms standing at intervals to provide the minor arrangements of deck chairs and rugs and hot bouillon that the morning required. The wind on the boat deck was, on this morning, a steady 12-knot breeze from the west, with a neat cool quality even in the bright August sun. You wore your wrap. You walked 4 circuits in the company of Mrs. Harrington, whom you encountered on her own morning constitutional after your first lap, and with whom, for the next 45 minutes, you walked side by side in the pleasant conversation that the morning walk facilitated. It was during this morning walk that you encountered, for the second time, the great financier J.P. Morgan. He was on the boat deck himself, walking with one of his secretaries in a heavy black overcoat over what appeared to be his ordinary morning suit. He took, by every account, a single morning circuit of the boat deck on every crossing he made, in the attentive exercise program that his physician had prescribed him in the closing years of his life. He was, on the morning we are describing, walking at a slow, deliberate pace in the company of one of the younger of his 2 secretaries, with the other secretary having been left, presumably, in the parlour suite to attend to whatever tight documents the morning's wireless cables had produced. He passed you in the opposite direction, on the second of your 4 circuits, and as he passed, he tipped his hat in the courteous gesture that the boat deck protocol of the era required between strangers, and Mrs. Harrington beside you, who took her transatlantic crossings with the sort of cheerful confidence that only an older Boston widow could quite muster, called across to him a basic, cheerful good morning. He returned the greeting in his thoughtful voice. He continued his walk. The whole encounter lasted perhaps 8 seconds. After the boat deck walk, you went down to the gymnasium, on the boat deck level itself in the plain structure just aft of the second funnel. The gymnasium of the Olympic was, in 1911, one of the more remarked-upon features of the ship. The gymnasium had been provided, on the considered theory of the White Star Line, in response to the increasing interest of the wealthy in physical exercise that the previous decade had produced. The gymnasium was a long, limited room, painted white throughout, lit by tall windows on its outer wall that gave a view down to the boat deck and out to sea, with the various items of equipment that the German firm of Wiedemann of Berlin had been supplying to the better gymnasiums of the era for the past several years. There were rowing machines, there were cycling machines, there were brief punching bags, there were dumbbells. There were the famous mechanical horses and mechanical camels measured sprung devices that simulated the motion of riding by means of a small electric motor that produced an individual rocking and galloping motion that was, by report, surprisingly tiring. The gymnasium was supervised by a notable instructor, an English physical culture specialist, whose name was Mr. Albright and who had been with the Olympic since her maiden voyage. He gave individual instruction. He set up the equipment for the various passengers who had not previously used it. He maintained the measured records of the morning attendances that the White Star Line required for its statistical purposes. You went to the gymnasium not on this occasion to use the equipment, but to look in. The wealthy women of the era who used the gymnasium did so in a specific practical version of their morning costume, a slightly looser skirt, a more practical shirtwaist, lower shoes, and you were not this morning dressed for it. You looked in for 10 minutes. There were perhaps 8 passengers using the equipment. There were 2 gentlemen on the rowing machines. There was a younger woman, perhaps 20, on one of the cycling machines, in a focused midi blouse and a slightly shorter skirt, and the chosen flat shoes that the gymnasium attendants permitted. There was, most strikingly, a woman of perhaps 45 on the mechanical horse, in full riding habit, sitting side saddle on the contraption with one hand on the deep leather pommel and the other holding a direct parasol, in the individual tableau that the photographs of the period have made into one of the lasting images of the Edwardian gymnasium, afloat. You watched the mechanical horse for a moment. Mr. Albright, who knew you were a passenger but who had not previously been introduced, came forward to provide the attentive welcome that the gymnasium's attendants required. He explained the various items of equipment. He suggested the half-hour session that he thought might suit you. You said that you would, perhaps, return the following morning. He gave you the restrained printed card with the gymnasium hours and the schedule of the available sessions. You thanked him. You left. I want to spend a moment with the social geography of the gymnasium, because the gymnasium represents one of the more interesting minor cultural shifts that the Edwardian era was producing in the wealthy class. The previous Victorian generation had not, on the whole, exercised. The wealthy women of the 1870s and 1880s had taken their physical activity through walking and riding and the deliberate dancing of the ballroom, and the suggestion that a respectable lady of their position might engage in vigorous physical exertion in a public gymnasium would have been considered, by the standards of their era, slightly unusual. The Edwardians, particularly the younger Edwardians, were beginning to think differently. The physical culture movement that had begun in the 1890s, with its various theorists of the connection between physical health and mental well-being, had begun to make the gymnasium a respectable place for women as well as men. The Olympic Gymnasium had a separate hour each morning between 10 and 11 that was reserved for women only. There was a separate hour between 11 and 12 that was reserved for men only. The hours from 1 to 3 were mixed. The hours from 3 to 5 were given over to children, with a notable instructor in the children's afternoon attendance. The whole arrangement was a thoughtful index of how the wealthy of the era were thinking about the question of physical health, and the fact that a major liner had been built with a substantial gymnasium as one of its public rooms was, in 1911, a plain index of how mainstream the new attitude had become. After the gymnasium, you went to the Veranda Café for the bouillon at 11. The bouillon at 11 was the plain mid-morning institution of the great liners, served in the open public rooms of the boat deck and the sun deck, and consisting of a tiny cup of hot beef broth and a small piece of bread or biscuit, served by the deck stewards from a small mobile cart. The bouillon was the plain concession to the cool sea air that the morning constitutional had produced, and it functioned as the mid-morning warmth between the breakfast of an hour and a half ago and the lunch of an hour and a half hence. You took your bouillon at a minor wicker table in the veranda, in the company of Miss Worthington, whom you had encountered on the deck, and who was, like you, in the lean late-morning pause of the day. The conversation between you continued the conversation that had begun the previous evening at the dinner. Miss Worthington told you more about her piano teacher in Vienna, about the specific technique she was hoping to develop, about the muted hopes she had for her own career as a concert pianist that her father, the Chicago industrialist, had reluctantly agreed to allow her to pursue for 1 year before. On the straightforward understanding between them, she returned to Chicago and got married. You listened. You asked the measured questions that an interested stranger could ask without appearing to inquire too closely. You wished her, with the chosen warmth that the bouillon hour produced, considerable success. After the bouillon, you returned to the cabin to change for lunch. The lunch costume was very similar to the previous days, with the limited variation that you had agreed with Hortense. The previous evening was appropriate for the second day at sea. You went down to the dining saloon at 1. Lunch was the same kind of substantial buffet and hot dishes meal that the previous day had been. The conversation at the table, with Mr. Holland and Mrs. Harrington and Miss Worthington, was, as I have suggested, settling now into the comfortable rhythm of an established small social grouping. By the end of lunch on the second day, the 4 of you had become, in the specific way that liner tables became, a lower tempore society of your own. After lunch, you returned to the cabin for the unadorned early afternoon rest that the experienced crossers learned to take. The rest, on the second day, was an hour. You read for the first half hour and slept for the second. You woke at 3:30. The afternoon of the second day was spent in the reading and writing room. The reading and writing room of the Olympic was, in the attentive designation of the marine architects, the principal first-class library and writing room of the ship. It occupied a substantial space on a deck, on the port side, with tall windows giving onto the boat deck. The room was decorated in the individual Georgian style that the marine architects had developed for the smaller and quieter of the public rooms: pale grey painted panelling, white painted plaster ceiling, soft rose-pink curtains at the windows, soft rose-pink upholstery on the wing chairs, and the small writing chairs at the desks. There was a substantial fireplace at one end of the room, again purely decorative, with the same unshowy electric arrangement that produced the effect of a banked fire. There was a substantial library at the other end, with perhaps 2,000 volumes in glass-fronted bookcases, novels, biographies, travel books, the small selection of light non-fiction that the shipboard library of the era had developed as its standard stock. There were perhaps a dozen writing desks along the walls, with the White Star Line stationery in minor leather folders, the confined pens and the underlying inkwells provided by the line, and the basic rose-pink shaded desk lamps that the soft afternoon light required. The reading and writing room was, by notable custom of the line, the principal ladies' room of the ship. The gentlemen used it also, but the predominant atmosphere of the room was a quiet, predominantly female one. The room, on the afternoon you spent in it, contained perhaps 15 passengers, 12 women and 3 gentlemen, in the plain, quiet pursuits of letter-writing and reading and spare needlework. The orchestra was not present. The neat string trio that had played in the veranda at tea was now, at this hour, in the smaller alcove off the lounge where it played its afternoon programme. The reading and writing room was in this sense one of the few public rooms on the ship in which silence was the predominant condition. There was the soft sound of the breeze through the windows. There was the minor distant murmur of conversation from the rooms beyond. There was the occasional slender turning of pages in a book. There was the occasional bank scratching of a pen on the line stationery. You wrote letters. You wrote one to your mother in New York, one to your elder sister in Philadelphia, one to your husband in London, and one to a friend in Paris, whom you had been corresponding with for several years, and whose latest letter had arrived just before your departure from New York. The letters took the better part of 2 hours. You wrote them in the deliberate, unhurried way that letter-writing on a ship permitted. with the direct luxury of having no other specific task to attend to and no immediate appointment to dress for. The 4 letters, when they were complete, would be carried in the ship's mail and posted from Southampton on her arrival the following Tuesday. The letter to your husband, although he would receive it perhaps 3 days after your own arrival in London and after your face-to-face reunion with him at Waterloo, was the sort of letter that the practice of the marriage required as an additional plain attention. He would read it after your arrival. He would reply in his thoughtful, slow way, in the chosen evening hours that the post-dinner period in your London house produced. The whole exchange of letters, even when its principals were, by the time the letters arrived, in the same room together, was one of the measured permanent institutions of the bicultural marriage that the Atlantic crossings of the period made necessary. The 3rd morning is the morning at which a 6-day crossing reaches its mid-Atlantic equilibrium. The land at either end is, in your sense of the world, equally distant. The ship, the temporary society aboard her, the rhythm of the meals and the dressings and the daily institutions, has fully replaced the geography you came from and the geography you are going to. You wake on the 3rd morning into the version of yourself that the crossing has by this point produced. Calmer, less hurried, slightly more attentive to the subtle details of the day, because there are no large details to attend to. You woke at 7:30. You took your morning tea. You read the bulletin. The bulletin reported a quiet night. The ship was at noon yesterday, approximately halfway between New York and Cherbourg. The previous 24 hours had produced a run of 508 nautical miles, which was slightly above the average, and which suggested that the captain had pushed the engines slightly to make up time against a tight headwind that the previous day had produced. The wireless news on the bulletin reported that there had been a squat earthquake in northern Italy, with limited damage. There had been the latest in the long sequence of plain developments in the question of Home Rule for Ireland, which the new Liberal government in London was beginning to consider seriously. There had been a plain notice about the upcoming opening of the new Manhattan Public Library, scheduled for the coming spring. There had been the daily cricket score, which on this morning reported the result of a county match in which Yorkshire had defeated Surrey by an innings. You decided on this 3rd morning to take the Turkish bath. The Turkish bath of the Olympic was one of the most elaborate single facilities on the ship, and it was, by general opinion of the regular crossers, one of the genuine luxuries of the first-class accommodation. It occupied a substantial section of F deck, 3 decks below the dining saloon, and it consisted of a sequence of rooms designed in what the marine architects had called the Pompeian style, although the actual style was an individual Edwardian fantasy of what the Romans had imagined Egypt to be like, with the various tiled rooms in deep blues and reds and greens and the restrained carved teak benches and the brass fittings and the mosaic floors. There was a minor entrance hall in pale blue tile. There was the cooling room, which was the principal social room of the bath complex, decorated in the most elaborate of the Pompeian styles, with red and blue tiles and limited carved teak partitions, and the subdued couches on which the bathers reclined for the relaxation portion of the experience. There was the steam room, there was the hot room, there was the straightforward plunge pool. There was the massage room, in which the masseuse on this voyage, a German-trained Austrian woman called Mrs. Kleinman, who had been with the Olympic since her maiden voyage, provided the standard hour of full-body massage that the better Turkish baths of the era included. The Turkish bath had separate hours for ladies and gentlemen. The ladies' hours were 10 until 1. The gentlemen's hours were 2 until 7. The hours from 7 to 9 in the evening were closed as the masseuse and the bath attendant required time for the cleaning and preparation of the rooms for the following day. You arrived at the entrance to the Turkish bath at 10:30. You were received by the bath attendant, a young Englishwoman of perhaps 30, whose name was Miss Wilson, who provided the plain linen wrap and the wooden clogs that the bath required, and who escorted you to the small dressing cubicle in which you changed. The Turkish bath proper took perhaps an hour and 45 minutes. You spent 20 minutes in the cooling room, in the plain initial period that allowed the body to adjust to the bath complex's general warmth. You spent 15 minutes in the steam room, with the heavy damp heat of the room producing the sort of profound sweating that the Turkish bath was designed to produce. You spent 10 minutes in the hot room, with the dry heat. You returned to the cooling room for a 20-minute pause. You went into the small plunge pool, in which the water was kept at a notable cold temperature for the minor invigorating plunge that the better Turkish baths of the era prescribed at the closing of the heat sequence. The plunge was, even on its focused voluntary basis, the sort of deep physical shock that the experienced bather learned to find exhilarating rather than punishing. You then went into the massage room, where Mrs. Kleinman administered the full hour of massage that the bath included. She was a serious professional. She did not chatter. She worked in the measured, methodical way that her training had given her, beginning with the feet and working up the legs and the back and the arms and the shoulders, with the specific attention to the plain accumulated tensions that the journey and the dressing rituals of the era reliably produced. By the time the massage was finished, you were in the sort of physical state that no shore-based equivalent had ever quite achieved for you. You felt as if you had been, in the strict sense of the word, refurbished. You returned to the cabin in the minor wrap and the wooden clogs that the bath had provided, by the private corridor that the bath complex used for the discreet movement of bathers between the bath and the cabin accommodation. Hortense was waiting. She helped you out of the wrap and into a soft tea gown for the faint light lunch that you had decided to take on this third day in the veranda cafe rather than in the dining saloon, because the morning's exertions in the Turkish bath had given you the sudden taste for a quieter and lighter meal than the buffet of the saloon would have provided. It was while taking the minor lunch in the veranda cafe that you received the lean note that would in due course lead to one of the more memorable single moments of the voyage. The note was brought by a young steward in the White Star Line uniform. He brought it on a muted silver tray, on which the unadorned folded card with your name written on its outer face had been placed by the chief steward of B Deck. The note was from Captain Smith. The captain, the note said, would be honoured if Mrs. Charlotte Whitmore would be willing to join him at his table for dinner on this evening, the third evening of the crossing, at 7 o'clock. The note was signed in the captain's own hand, in the attentive copperplate that the senior officers of the White Star Line cultivated as one of the marks of their professional dignity. The captain's table on a great Edwardian liner was the social pinnacle of any given crossing. The captain's table seated, on most White Star ships, between 8 and 12 passengers, who were selected by the captain himself in consultation with the chief steward, on the basis of their social position, their previous association with the line, their chosen interest in conversation that he thought might be agreeable, or their connection with whatever celebrity passenger he might also have invited on the same evening. The invitation to the captain's table was a limited honour that produced in its recipients the individual kind of pleasant flattered pride that small social honours of this kind reliably produced. You had been invited to the captain's table once before, on a previous westbound crossing on the Adriatic the previous spring, in the company of your husband, and you knew accordingly what the experience would involve. The dressing would be the most elaborate of the crossing, the conversation would be carefully managed, the food and the wine would be of the highest quality the kitchen could produce. The whole evening would be one of the minor notable pleasures of a long crossing, and you would, in the morning of the day after, allow yourself the private pride of having been included in it. The reason for your invitation, you suspected as you read the note over the lower lunch in the veranda cafe, was your husband. The captains of major liners cultivated, as a basic element of their professional duty, the acquaintance of the senior English diplomatic and political establishment, and the wife of a senior Foreign Office figure travelling alone was, in the plain commercial calculus of their hospitality, the sort of passenger they made a point of inviting. The invitation was not, in this sense, entirely personal, but it was no less welcome for that. You wrote your acceptance on the brief reply card that the steward had brought with the note. The steward, who had waited at the unshowy distance for the reply, took the card. He thanked you. He bowed slightly. He went away. The invitation to the captain's table, when you considered the matter at lunch, was going to require a specific dressing for the evening that would draw from the more deliberate end of the wardrobe Hortense had unpacked. You sent word to Hortense that the dressing for the evening would need to be elevated. She would, you knew, already have begun the consideration of the appropriate gown, on the minor information that the chief steward of B deck would have already conveyed to her by the time you returned to the cabin. You finished the lunch. You took a brief turn on the boat deck. The early afternoon at sea on the third day of the crossing was the same unbroken horizon and the same clean Atlantic wind and the same quality of mid-ocean light that the previous days had produced, and you spent perhaps half an hour at the rail in the confined contemplative state that the post-massage hours of a Turkish bath morning reliably produced, watching the sea and the sky and the underlying endless wake of the ship spreading out behind her toward the western horizon you had left 2 days earlier. It was during this direct period at the rail that I want to give you the one thoughtful passage about the ship's younger sister that I promised at the start of our story. I am going to give it to you here, in the third afternoon of the crossing, because the third afternoon is the plain reflective hour, at which a long crossing produces the chosen kind of meditative attention that the passage requires. After this passage, we will say no more about the matter. We will return to your crossing. We will continue with the dressing for the captain's table. The Olympic, on this August afternoon in 1911, was at the top of her form. She was 3 months into her working life. She would, in 17 days from now, on the 20th of September, collide with the British naval cruiser HMS Hawke off the Isle of Wight in a tiny navigational accident that would produce no fatalities, but would put her into the Belfast yards for repairs for the next 2 months. She would emerge from those repairs in November and resume her crossings. She would continue in service for 24 years more until she was retired in 1935 in the difficult years of the Great Depression that had reduced first-class Atlantic travel to a fraction of its former volume. She would carry in the period of the Great War hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic in the troopship service, in which capacity she earned the affectionate nickname Old Reliable from the men who travelled in her. She would, in 1918, in a notable moment of her wartime service, ram and sink a German submarine that had attempted to torpedo her, becoming the only merchant vessel of the war to sink an enemy submarine by ramming. She would be, by the end of her working life, one of the most beloved ships ever to have served on the North Atlantic run. Her younger sister, Titanic, was at this moment fitting out at the Belfast yards. She would be launched in 2 months, from the same slipway from which the Olympic had been launched the previous year. She would complete her sea trials in March and April of 1912. She would sail on her maiden voyage from Southampton on the 10th of April 1912, with a passenger list of 2,224 people. She would strike an iceberg on the night of the 14th of April 1912, 4 nights into her voyage, at 20 minutes to midnight ship's time, at a position 2.5 hours steaming southeast of the Grand Banks. She would sink in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The captain on her bridge that night would be the same Edward Smith who on this August evening in 1911 was at his desk in his cabin on the boat deck of the Olympic, considering the seating plan for the dinner he was about to host. Of the 2,224 people on Titanic that night, 1,514 would die. They would die because the lifeboat capacity for both ships had been calculated according to the regulations of an earlier era when ships were smaller, and there were not enough lifeboats for half of the people aboard. They would die because the water of the North Atlantic on a clear April night, at a temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit, kills a person in the water in an average of 15 minutes. They would die because the rescue ship that did eventually arrive, the Carpathia, was 4 hours steaming away when the call went out, and she could not arrive in time. Wallace Hartley, the bandmaster you saw conducting the neat string ensemble in the Veranda Cafe yesterday afternoon, would transfer to the Titanic for her maiden voyage. He would lead the band in playing music on the boat deck as the ship sank. He would die. The chief steward of B Deck, the same Mr. Andrews who had welcomed you aboard at the head of the gangway in New York, would not transfer. He would continue his service on the Olympic for some years more. Captain Smith, who had been with the Olympic since her maiden voyage, and whose handwriting is on the note that arrived at your lunch table this afternoon, would transfer to the Titanic in March of 1912. He would die. I have told you all of this in this single measured passage because the listener, in the private back of his or her mind, has known it from the first sentence of this story, and it is better to acknowledge the knowledge than to pretend it is not there. We will not return to it. The Olympic will live. The crossing we are walking through will end successfully at Southampton next Tuesday afternoon. The world that you and Charlotte are now inhabiting on this August afternoon at the rail of the Olympic in mid-Atlantic is a world at the top of its long Edwardian summer with 3 years and a few weeks left before the war that ended it. None of this is yet visible from the rail of the boat deck. The ship beneath your feet is the most magnificent moving object the world has yet produced. The crossing is going beautifully. The sun on the water is the same sun. You stand at the rail. The wind moves your hair. The ship moves eastward. The Atlantic turns slowly under you toward the night. Now, let us return. The dressing for the captain's table is in 2.5 hours. Hortense has been at work in the cabin since you left the veranda. The most considered of the 4 evening gowns has been brought out and pressed. The most considered of the jewels has been brought up from the ship's safe by the attentive arrangement that the bursar's office maintained for the more elaborate dinners. The hair will require the deliberate, elaborate version of the evening pompadour, with the slender comb of paste diamonds and the banked spray of cream silk roses and the additional plain decorative pin that the captain's table dressing required. You went down to the cabin. The afternoon light through the porthole was beginning to lengthen. The plain clock on the dressing table showed 4:30. The captain's table awaited. The dressing for the captain's table that evening was the most elaborate dressing of the crossing so far. The gown that Hortense had selected was one that she had been quietly holding in reserve for an occasion of this kind, a gown that you and your dressmaker had agreed, when it had been ordered the previous spring, would be the most considered of the evening gowns of the year. It was a gown in pale ivory silk satin, with overlay of antique Brussels lace at the bodice and at the hem, with the long sweeping skirt of the era and the short lace sleeves, with the soft décolletage that the formal evening required, and with the minor detail of a pale pink silk rose at the waist that the dressmaker had introduced, against your initial reluctance, and that you had come to consider one of the successful judgments she had made on your behalf. The gown was the sort of evening gown that a young Englishwoman of fashion would have considered correct for a private dinner at one of the more important London houses, and it would accordingly hold its own at any captain's table. The jewellery was on this occasion rather more substantial than it had been on the first evening. Hortense had brought up from the ship's safe the measured leather case that contained your husband's mother's pearl and diamond brooch, which had been entrusted to you on the 3rd anniversary of your marriage, and which was, on the private accounting of your jewellery box, the single most valuable piece you possessed. There was the triple strand of pearls, there were the matching pearl earrings, there was the diamond hair comb that the elaborate evening pompadour required, there was a minor pearl and diamond bracelet that you had worn at the previous month's Astor dinner in New York. The whole assembly, when it was complete, was the sort of evening jewellery that the captain's table of the Olympic in 1911 would have expected from any wealthy young matron of fashion, and you wore it accordingly. The dressing took an hour and 10 minutes. The bugler began his tight progress through the corridors at 5 minutes to 7. You stepped out of the cabin, with Hortense holding the door, and you walked along the corridor in the considered sweep of the gown to the staircase, and from the staircase up to a deck, where the captain's table was that evening to be hosted in the private dining room that the captain used for his more individual dinners. The private dining room was a small panelled room off the main dining saloon, accessible through a restrained connecting door, and it had been designed for precisely these occasions. It seated, in its standard configuration, 12. It was decorated, like the main saloon, in the Jacobean oak panelling, but with a single substantial round table at the centre, rather than the long parallel tables of the main room, and with a single great chandelier above the table, providing the principal light. You were directed to the private dining room by the chief steward, who was waiting at the entrance to the main saloon to greet the captain's table guests. You arrived at 3 minutes past 7. There were already 4 other guests present in the room. The captain himself had not yet arrived. The 4 other guests you saw at a glance were people of the kind that the captain's table would have expected. There was an English duchess, perhaps 50 years old, of whom you had heard and whom you knew slightly by reputation. She was the Dowager Duchess of one of the older English ducal houses, recently widowed, on her way home from a visit to her sister in Connecticut. She was tall, thin, in a gown of black silk satin with a single long string of black pearls, the slightly muted dress of a woman in the closing months of her formal year of mourning. She greeted you with the formal courtesy that her position required, and you, recognizing her name from your husband's earlier description of her, responded with the equivalent thoughtful courtesy that the English protocol required. There was an American senator, perhaps 60 years old, in his evening dress with the limited additional ribbon of some American honor at the throat that you did not recognize. He was Senator Gardner of Maine, on his way to Europe for an official visit to the various European parliaments that the State Department had arranged. He was accompanied by his wife, a woman of perhaps 55 in a gown of dark green silk and a notable set of emerald jewellery that her husband's tin mining and railroad investments had clearly funded. There was a younger man, perhaps 35, who was introduced to you as the Honourable Mr. Guest of Devon. You gathered from the squat introductions that the chief steward provided, a member of parliament for one of the West Country constituencies, the second son of a baron, on his way home from the same kind of business visit to the United States that Mr. Holland, your dining companion, had been on, although on a more political than commercial mission. He was unmarried. He was tall, fair-haired, slightly diffident in the measured way of the English gentleman politician of the era, and he greeted you with a plain, slight bow. The remaining 3 places at the table were not yet filled. You and the 4 other early arrivals stood in the plain group at the centre of the room, in the attentive conversation that the moments before a captain's table dinner required, while the chief steward stood at the door, holding the seating book. Captain Edward Smith arrived at 7:05. He was 61 years old. He was a Staffordshire man by birth, had been at sea since the age of 13, had been with the White Star Line for 24 years, and had been the senior captain of the line for the past 7 years. He was in the limited commercial calculus of the line, the captain to whom the most important new ships were given on their maiden voyages. He had been the captain of the Olympic since her maiden voyage in June. He would, as I have already described, transfer to the Titanic the following March. He was, in his physical bearing, the sort of magnificent professional sailor that the Edwardian generation had developed to a particular high pitch. He was tall, and was bearded, in the full white naval beard that the senior officers of the period favoured. He carried himself with the particular authority that command of a great ship reliably produced in the men who exercised it. He was wearing his full-dress uniform, the dark blue with the gold rings of his rank on the sleeves, the white shirt and white waistcoat, the black tie. He greeted each of the assembled guests by name as he came round the room. He called you Mrs. Whitmore. He shook your hand. He thanked you for accepting his invitation. He moved on. The remaining 3 guests arrived in the next 5 minutes. There was an elderly American novelist of considerable reputation, whose name I am going to leave unspecified because the deliberate etiquette of the captain's table required that the famous novelists of the era be received without the sort of public note that would diminish the slight informal pleasure of the encounter. He was a man of about 70. He was returning to his villa in Italy after a brief visit to New York. He had, in the previous decade, been one of the more celebrated American writers of the period. He was in this evening, as in many evenings of his older life, slightly weary and slightly courteous, and slightly delighted to be the centre of the focused attention that his presence at any dinner table reliably produced. There was a French opera singer, a soprano of perhaps 35, who was returning to Paris after a season of guest appearances at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Her name was Mademoiselle Latour. She was of no particular distinction in the subdued history of opera, but she was, in 1911, in the straightforward immediate present of the Atlantic crossing, one of the more glittering of the regular crossers, and her presence at the captain's table that evening was the sort of touch of theatrical glamour that the captain liked to include when he could. There was, finally, the gentleman whose presence I had been holding back as the particular surprise of the evening. He arrived last. He arrived alone, although his secretary had walked him to the door of the private dining room, and would, you understood, be waiting in the corridor outside until he should be ready to be escorted back to the parlour suite at the conclusion of the evening. He was John Pierpont Morgan. Captain Smith introduced him to the table, in the thoughtful way that the captain's table introductions of major figures required. The introduction was perhaps unnecessary. Everyone in the room knew who he was. The Duchess inclined her head in the formal way that the English aristocracy had developed for the acknowledgement of foreign princes of finance. The senator and his wife, who had perhaps met him before, greeted him with the minor American directness that their political circumstances permitted. The Honourable Mr. Guest gave him the measured bow that an English member of Parliament would have given a visiting head of a major foreign concern. The novelist, who had perhaps known him in earlier years, made some deep private remark in his ear that produced, briefly, the sort of smile that the photographs of Morgan rarely captured. Mademoiselle Latour, who was perhaps the most experienced cosmopolitan in the room, gave him the attentive French bow that the slight curtsy within a European context required from a soprano to a financier of his standing. You were introduced to him by the captain, in your turn. The captain explained briefly that you were the wife of Mr. Whitmore of the Foreign Office, returning home from a visit to your family in New York. Morgan, who was, as I have said, 74 years old and slightly weary and considerably preoccupied, looked at you with the thoughtful attention that his manners had always required. He was, in the private accounting of the evening, more courteous than his public reputation suggested. He took your hand. He thanked you for your acquaintance. He said that he had known your husband's father, the previous Earl, who had been involved in some matter of international finance in the 1890s in a connection that Morgan now mentioned, and that you, in the social embarrassment of having only the haziest knowledge of your father-in-law's earlier career, were unable to confirm or deny. He moved on to the senator. The dinner began at 7:20. The captain seated the table according to the protocol that the captain's table required. He himself sat at the head. The Duchess, as the most senior lady, sat at his right. Morgan, as the most distinguished gentleman, sat at his left. You, as the youngest of the ladies, were placed at the foot of the table opposite the captain, with the Honourable Mr. Guest on your left, and the novelist on your right. Mrs. Senator was at Morgan's left. The senator was at the Duchess's right. Mademoiselle Latour was between Mrs. Senator and Mr. Guest. The placements, in their deliberate arrangement, would govern the conversation for the duration of the dinner. I do not propose to give you the menu of the captain's table dinner in the same detail that I gave the menu of the first night's dinner, because the broad shape was the same 9 courses, in the same general progression, with the same accompanying wines, and the lean variations of the captain's table dinner are not the principal point of the evening. The principal point of the evening was the conversation, and the conversation, in the version of the evening that the muted private dining room produced, was the sort of conversation that no other setting on the ship could have managed. The captain's table conversation took, as captain's table conversations conventionally did, a thoughtful set of turns. There was the opening exchange about the weather and the ship's progress, which the captain conducted with the plain professional competence that his position required. There was the second exchange, which moved on to the recent international news that the wireless had brought aboard. There was the third exchange, which on the captain's prompt moved into the more particular interests of the various guests, with the senator describing his upcoming European programme, the Duchess describing her recent visit to her sister, the novelist describing the state of his current work in progress, Mademoiselle Latour describing her plans for her Paris season, Mr. Guest describing the parliamentary session that awaited him on his return to London. The captain managed all of this with the measured skill that the senior White Star Line captains had developed for these dinners. He drew each guest into the conversation. He prevented any single guest from dominating it. He nudged the conversation when it threatened to drift into political territory that might prove uncomfortable, into smaller and more agreeable subjects. He produced, by the time the cheese arrived, the sort of complete social experience that the captain's table on a great Edwardian liner was supposed to produce. Morgan, throughout the dinner, was less talkative than the others. He was, by the standards of his public reputation, in a relatively expansive mood. He told a brief story about a particular financial crisis of the previous decade that produced, in the intimate company of the table, the sort of inside laughter that no public account of the same story would have produced. He gave the senator an attentive piece of advice about the European bankers the senator should make a point of meeting in his upcoming tour. He praised the Olympic in a lower formal speech to the captain at one point of the dinner, in the sort of way that the principal owner of a ship was expected to praise his ship to its captain in the company of distinguished passengers. He drank, you noticed, very little of the wine. He ate, you noticed, very little of the food. He was, in this as in many other brief details, a man whose great public power was matched by a private personal restraint that the casual observer of his career would not have entirely predicted. You spoke, during the dinner, principally with Mr. Guest on your left and the novelist on your right. The novelist was the more interesting of the two conversations. He was a man who had spent his life in the deliberate observation of human society, and his conversation reflected the accumulated plain observations of 50 years of writing about the people of his time. He talked to you about his current book, which was a long novel set in Italy, and which was giving him, he said, considerably more difficulty than its predecessors had. He talked to you about the question of being an American writer in Europe, which was a tiny subject he had been considering for the past 40 years, and on which his views had become, in his old age, more thoughtful and more melancholy than they had been in his youth. He talked to you at one point of the dinner about your own situation, the American girl married to the Englishman, the long Atlantic crossings, the unshowy bicultural texture of a life lived in two places, with a close attention that surprised you in its specificity. He had been, you suspected, gathering minor fragments of conversation about you from the captain's preliminary briefing. He was a serious professional. He was watching the table the way a serious professional watches a table when he is at it. Mr. Guest on your left was a different proposition. He was a competent young politician in the early stages of his career, with the sort of slightly diffident charm that the second sons of barons cultivated. He spoke to you about parliamentary politics in the confined introductory way that his profession required when he was speaking to a woman of unfamiliar political position. He spoke to you about Devon, where his family had an underlying estate, and where he hoped, when his parliamentary commitments permitted, to spend more of the autumn than he had been able to manage in recent years. He spoke to you at one point about your husband, whom he had encountered briefly at a Foreign Office function the previous winter, and whom he remembered with a particular affection. The conversation with Mr. Guest was, like the conversation with the novelist, the kind of conversation that a captain's table could produce, and that no other setting on the ship would have made available to you. The dinner ended at 10:20, 3 hours. The captain, in his closing speech of welcome and farewell, thanked the guests for their company and wished them a continued pleasant crossing. Morgan rose. The Duchess rose. The senator and his wife rose. The novelist, with a measured courtesy, rose. Mademoiselle Latour rose with a neat theatrical sweep. Mr. Guest and you rose together. The party broke up in the attentive way that the captain's table dinners broke up, with the minor parting courtesies and the slender expressions of pleasure that the evening had produced. You took a banked turn through the lounge after the dinner, in the company of the Duchess, who had decided that her own evening would not yet end. The two of you sat together in a quiet corner of the lounge for perhaps half an hour, with a plain glass of cordial each, while the orchestra in the alcove played a selected group of Schubert. The Duchess, freed from the social discipline of the captain's table, was a more interesting conversational partner than her formal manner had suggested. She told you in the low voice that the late hour permitted, about her late husband and about the private texture of a long English aristocratic marriage that had ended only a few months previously. She told you about her sister in Connecticut, who had married an American banker 40 years earlier and had become, in the long subsequent decades, more American than English. She told you, with a careful affection, that you reminded her, slightly, of her sister at 25. The conversation between you had the particular quality that female conversations across a generation occasionally produce, and you would, in the morning of the day that followed, remember this subdued late-night conversation in the lounge of the Olympic with a particular fondness for the rest of your life. You went to bed at 11:30. You slept. The fourth day brought the fog. The Grand Banks of Newfoundland are the great submerged plateau that extends southeast from the coast of Newfoundland into the open Atlantic. They are, in oceanographic terms, a particularly productive fishing ground because of the meeting of the cold Labrador Current from the north with the warm Gulf Stream from the south, and the temperature differential between the two great currents produces, with predictable regularity, the famous fogs of the Grand Banks. The Atlantic crossings of the great liners, eastbound or westbound, generally passed through the Grand Banks region somewhere in the middle portion of the voyage, and the experience of fog on the Grand Banks was one of the standard incidents of the crossing. On a westbound voyage in spring, the fog could last for days. On an eastbound voyage in late summer, the fog was generally a single afternoon, the kind of brief atmospheric incident that the crossing reliably produced and that the passengers had been told about in advance. The fog began at about 10 in the morning of the fourth day. You were on the boat deck for your morning constitutional when you noticed, ahead of the ship, the first sign of the bank of grey that was beginning to mass on the eastern horizon. The captain on the bridge would have seen it earlier. The change in the engine note, perhaps 15 minutes before the fog actually closed in, was the first audible indication. The engines, which had been running at the full cruising speed of 21 knots, were eased back to 17, then to 15, then to 12. The ship, in response to the reduction in power, settled slightly lower into the water and began to move with the slightly different motion that the slower speed produced. The foghorn began to sound. The foghorn of the Olympic was, like her main whistle, a particularly substantial instrument, and its deep mournful note was designed to be heard by other ships at a distance of perhaps 3 to 5 miles in conditions of poor visibility. It sounded once every 2 minutes, in the standard regulation pattern that the rules of the road at sea required. The sound of it, in the increasingly thick air around the ship, took on the slightly muffled quality that fog produces in any sound, and the whole atmosphere of the ship shifted in the careful way that fogs at sea reliably shift it, into the quieter and more inward mode that conditions of restricted visibility required. By 10:30, the fog had closed in completely. You could not, from the rail of the boat deck, see the bow of the ship. You could barely, from the rail, see the surface of the sea below. The whole world had been reduced in the plain enclosed bubble that the fog produced, to perhaps 50 feet in any direction. The ship continued to move at a careful 12 knots through the white, with the foghorn sounding every 2 minutes, and the distant bell of the lookout in the crow's nest sounding occasionally to acknowledge the passage of unseen objects on the private radar of his attention. The Atlantic, which had until this morning been the great open sea of a long crossing, had become an enclosed white room. The passengers on the boat deck retreated, in the minor instinctive way that fog produced, to the interior public rooms of the ship. The veranda cafe, where you went for your bouillon at 11, was considerably more populated than usual. The lounge was full. The reading and writing room was full. The whole first-class population of the ship had been driven by the fog into the tight enclosed rooms of the interior, and the conversation in those rooms had taken on the particular quality of conversation that fog at sea reliably produced, slightly subdued, slightly more confidential, with the muted awareness that the great empty Atlantic had been, for a few hours, suspended. You spent the morning in the writing room, finishing the letter to your friend in Paris that you had begun on the previous afternoon, and reading for an hour from the novel you had brought with you. The foghorn outside the window continued to sound at its regular 2-minute intervals. The motion of the ship at the slower speed was slightly different. The whole atmosphere of the writing room was the muffled grey light of a fogged-in interior, with the soft pink-shaded lamps providing the principal illumination. The other passengers in the room were quieter than they had been the previous afternoon. There was a particular quality of attention that the fog produced. People were, for a few hours, slightly more alert to one another, slightly less inclined to take the ship for granted. The fog was, in this sense, one of the genuine incidents of the crossing, and the passengers responded to it in the careful way that the regular crossers had learned to expect. The fog began to lift at about 3 in the afternoon. The lifting of a Grand Banks fog is a particular measured event of the crossing that the experienced traveller looks out for. The fog begins to thin in patches. Small gaps appear in the white. Through the holes the sun is briefly visible, and then is hidden again as the fog drifts back. The horizon ahead, which has been 50 feet for hours, suddenly extends to 100 feet, then to 200, then to half a mile, then to the full open Atlantic horizon that has been waiting all day for the moment of its return. The whole process takes perhaps an hour. By 4 o'clock the fog had cleared completely, and the ship was sailing again under the open August sun in the minor clean Atlantic light that had returned, and the engines had been worked back up to their full cruising speed, and the narrow temporary suspension of the crossing was over. You went to the boat deck for the lower remaining hour of the afternoon, in the particular pleasure of the return of the open horizon after the morning of the fog. You walked 4 circuits with Mrs. Harrington, in the plain renewed energy that the lifting of the fog had produced in everyone aboard. The conversation between you continued the gradual accumulation of acquaintance that the 4 days of the crossing had now produced. Mrs. Harrington, by this point of the voyage, was beginning to feel for you the particular affection that older Boston widows occasionally developed for younger married women whom they encountered on long crossings, and she was beginning, in the careful way of her generation, to treat you slightly as a daughter rather than as a fellow passenger. You found, in the gradual accumulation of her affection, one of the minor, unexpected pleasures of the voyage. The dressing for dinner that evening was the most elaborate of the crossing apart from the captain's table. The 4th night of an Atlantic crossing was, on the narrow calendar that the White Star Line had developed for the passengers' entertainment, the night of the principal social event of the voyage. There would be a special dinner, slightly more elaborate than the standard dinners of the other evenings. There would after dinner be an underlying dance in the lounge, with the orchestra extending its evening programme to play dance music for the younger passengers and the unadorned minority of the older ones who were inclined to dance. The whole evening was the plain additional structure that the line had been adding to the routine of the crossing over the previous several years, and it was now, by 1911, one of the established spare traditions of the Olympic, and her sister. The dinner that evening was, as the dressing required, considerably elaborate. The chef Henri Jaillet had prepared a particular menu that was the restrained showcase of his particular style. There was the consommé, on this evening a clear consommé royale with small custard garnishes. There was the fish, on this evening a sole bonne femme. There was the entree, on this evening a minor chicken lyonnaise. There was the sorbet. There was the principal roast. On this evening a saddle of lamb with a particular bouquetière garnish. There was the game. On this evening a narrow roast partridge in season. There was the cold dish. There was the sweet. On this evening a particular charlotte russe. There were the cheeses and the dessert. The wine accompaniments were correspondingly elevated, with a particular vintage of Bollinger as the principal champagne, and a particular older claret with the roast. After dinner, the lounge was rearranged for the dance. The banked alcove at the far end of the room, where the orchestra usually played, was extended by the addition of 2 further musicians from the second-class orchestra, producing a basic dance band of 7 instruments. The chairs and the plain tables were moved to the perimeter of the room, leaving the central floor open for dancing. The lighting was adjusted slightly, and the chandeliers above the dance floor were dimmed. The plain wall sconces around the perimeter were brightened. The whole room took on the particular atmosphere of a private ball at a London or New York establishment. The dance began at 9:30. The orchestra played a small selection of the standard ballroom dances of the era. There was a waltz, there was a 2-step. There was a minor selection of the lighter modern dances that the younger generation had been bringing into the ballrooms over the past several years. The dancing was the narrow mixed company dancing that the crossing protocol permitted, with the husbands dancing with the wives, the unmarried young men dancing with the unmarried young women, the captains and the senior officers. Captain Smith himself made a squat token appearance in his uniform and danced 1 waltz with the Duchess from the previous night's dinner, and the particular plain company of the unmarried older women who, like the Duchess, had decided that the evening would not yet quite end. You did not dance on this evening with anyone in particular. You were a married woman, alone, and the dance protocol of the era did not require you to dance, although it permitted you to do so if a particular partner of appropriate position were to ask. The Honourable Mr. Guest, whom you had met at the captain's table the previous evening, asked you to dance the 3rd waltz. He was a competent dancer, in the careful manner of the second son of an English baron. The waltz lasted perhaps 4 minutes. You thanked him at its close. He thanked you. The exchange was in the careful protocol of an English politician's encounter with a Foreign Office wife, the slight overture toward a future London acquaintance that would, you understood, develop in due course into the social courtesy of his calling on your husband at the Foreign Office in some upcoming week, and being invited by your husband on his behalf to an intimate dinner at your house the following month. The whole exchange was the kind of small social step that the captain's table dinners and the post-dinner dances on Atlantic crossings reliably produced, and that the London and New York social calendars subsequently absorbed into the narrow ongoing texture of established professional life. You stayed at the dance until 11. You watched, from a minor chair at the perimeter, the younger passengers dancing the more energetic of the modern dances. You spoke briefly with Mrs. Harrington, who had come down to the lounge to watch the dancing for an hour, and who was, in the subdued, comfortable way of her age and widowhood, content to observe rather than participate. You went to bed at 11:30. You slept. The 5th day was Sunday. Sunday at sea on a White Star liner was a particular quieter day than the weekdays of the crossing. The line, in observance of the Sabbath that the English passengers expected, and that the line's English Anglican origins reflected, conducted on Sunday morning a divine service in the dining saloon at 11 o'clock. The service was conducted by the captain himself, in his dress uniform, in the established tradition that the senior captains of the line had been observing for the previous half-century. The captain's qualification as a chaplain was, in the formal sense, the qualification of a master mariner under the regulations of the Merchant Shipping Act, which permitted the captain of a British vessel at sea to conduct divine service on the Sabbath in the absence of an ordained clergyman. The service, which the captains of the line had over the years developed into a particular direct set form, was the standard Anglican service of morning prayer, with the plain adaptations that the shipboard setting required. It included the Lord's Prayer, the selected group of psalms appropriate to the day, the standard set of hymns from the plain Royal Navy hymnal that the line had adopted for its services, the reading of the day's lessons, and the captain's brief homiletic remarks on the lessons. Service was attended by the first-class and second-class passengers in the dining saloon, with the third-class passengers given the option of attending in the minor overflow space at the rear of the room. The whole event was one of the genuine institutions of the Atlantic crossing, and it was, for many of the passengers, one of the more memorable single hours of the voyage. You attended the service. You sat in the first-class section in a deep folding chair that had been set up for the purpose in the company of Mrs. Harrington and Mr. Holland from your dining table, and several other passengers from the surrounding tables of the saloon. The hymns were the standard hymns of the Royal Navy hymnal, Eternal Father, Strong to Save, of course, which is the great seafarer's hymn that no Sunday service at sea was complete without. There was Holy, Holy, Holy. There was a plain selection from the standard Anglican repertoire of the period. The captain, in his white-bearded magnificence in the dress uniform, conducted the service with the careful piety that the position required. He read the lessons in a measured voice. He gave the brief homiletic remarks that the standard service required on the lessons of the day in the careful, unsensational style that a senior White Star Line captain was expected to bring to such occasions. The whole service took perhaps 50 minutes. The Sunday lunch after the service was the standard Sunday dinner that the English tradition of the era required. There was a roast beef with all of the standard accompaniments, the Yorkshire pudding, the horseradish, the roast potatoes, the seasonal vegetables. The Sunday lunch in the dining saloon was in this sense a particular adaptation of the great Sunday tradition of the English country house, transplanted onto the Atlantic. It was eaten with a particular satisfaction by the English passengers, and with a minor interested attention by the Americans. The wine was a particular older claret. The whole meal had the particular ceremonial quality that the Sunday observance of the English tradition produced. The afternoon of the Sunday was given over, by the muted unwritten convention of the line, to a quieter and more reflective set of activities than the weekdays had produced. There was no dance. There was no particular evening event. The straightforward recreational activities on the decks were quieter. There was no shuffleboard, no deck quoits. The gymnasium was closed for the day. The reading and writing room was busier than usual, with the writing of letters home and the plain Sunday reading that many of the passengers preferred. The veranda cafe was open, but the orchestra played a quieter and more reflective program than its weekday repertoire. There was Mendelssohn, there was a selected group from Brahms, there was a small piece of Bach. The whole atmosphere of the ship on the 5th day of the crossing was the slightly quieter and slightly more reflective version of the atmosphere of the previous days, and the passengers, in the modest unconscious way that travellers of long crossings respond to the rhythms of their voyage, settled into the quieter mode without protest. You spent the afternoon in the writing and reading room, finishing the novel you had been reading, and then in the veranda cafe in the company of Mrs. Harrington for the late tea. The tea was, as I have said, a slightly quieter affair than the weekday teas. The orchestra played quietly. The veranda was less full than usual. The conversation between you and Mrs. Harrington was the kind of slow, comfortable conversation that the closing days of a long crossing reliably produced between people who had begun the crossing as strangers and had now on the 5th day become something approaching friends. Mrs. Harrington was by this point of the voyage treating you with the particular warmth that I have already mentioned, and the conversation between you had, on this Sunday afternoon, taken on the particular reflective quality that the Sunday at sea reliably produced. I want to spend a moment on the narrow, distant glimpse of the lower decks that the Sunday afternoon, in its lower distinct way, occasionally permitted. The first-class passengers of a great Edwardian liner did not, in the ordinary course of the voyage, encounter the second-class or third-class passengers in any meaningful way. The decks were segregated by class, with the first-class boat deck and promenade deck, and A deck reserved for first-class use, and the second-class and third-class passengers having their own decks at the rear of the ship. The interior public rooms were similarly segregated. The dining saloons of the 3 classes were separate. The lounges were separate. The smoking rooms were separate. The whole apparatus of the ship was a careful 3-class organization that prevented by design the kind of casual encounter between classes that a more egalitarian arrangement would have permitted. There were, however, unadorned moments at which the segregation became visible to the first-class observer. The Sunday Divine Service was one. The third-class passengers had been permitted to attend in the plain overflow space at the rear of the dining saloon, and you had seen them, briefly, as you came in. They were, you saw, the particular tiny flotilla of emigrant families and working travellers that an Atlantic crossing in this era reliably contained. There were the Italian and Eastern European emigrants who were going home for a visit to the families they had left behind in their original countries, with the considerable savings of several years of work in the American factories now to be dispensed in the form of modest gifts and new clothes for the relatives. There were the English and Scottish working travellers who were returning home from a season of work in the United States. There were a limited number of Irish emigrants who had decided, after some years of trying America, that home was where they would prefer to spend the rest of their lives. They sat in the minor overflow space, in the kind of careful Sunday best that the Sunday service required. The men in their dark suits, the women in their best dresses, the children, there were perhaps a dozen children in the third-class group at the service, in their narrow, clean clothes. They had attended the service in the same Anglican order that the first and second classes had used, although, you suspected, a substantial proportion of them were in fact Catholic, and would have preferred, if the line had offered it, the Catholic Mass that no White Star Line ship provided. They had stood and sat and sung in the same parts of the service as the rest of the room. They had, at the brief gesture of the captain at the close of the service, exited from the dining saloon back to their own decks at the rear of the ship through the low connecting corridors that separated the classes. You had watched them briefly as they left. The careful procession of perhaps 33rd class passengers leaving the dining saloon at the close of the divine service, on a Sunday morning at sea, was the plain visible reminder that the ship contained a population that the first-class passenger did not in the ordinary course of the voyage encounter. The third-class fare from Southampton to New York was, as I mentioned in our opening, around £7. The £7 was for an emigrant family the substantial accumulated savings of months of careful planning, and the crossing was being undertaken not as the private luxury of the rich, but as the considered expensive necessity of the working life. You did not, on the careful etiquette of the era, Remark on this stark reminder to your fellow first-class passengers, who would have considered the remark slightly out of place, but you had registered it. The crossing that you and Mrs. Harrington and Mr. Holland and Miss Worthington had been taking, in your various minor comforts, was being shared by perhaps 1,000 other passengers in the lower decks of the same ship, in conditions considerably less comfortable, for purposes considerably more practical, in lives considerably less fortunate. The fact had, on the private accounting that an honest person occasionally conducts on a Sunday afternoon at sea, registered, the Sunday evening dinner was the standard formal dinner of the crossing, slightly less elaborate than the captain's table dinner of the third night, and slightly less elaborate than the dance dinner of the fourth, but still a substantial 9-course meal in the standard White Star Line style. You ate it in the dining saloon at your usual table, with Mrs. Harrington and Mr. Holland and Miss Worthington. The conversation between the four of you by the 5th night of the crossing had reached the comfortable established rhythm that long table groupings produced. You spoke about the day. You spoke about the low upcoming arrival at Cherbourg the following morning, which would be the first land you had seen in 5 days. You spoke about the private plans that each of you had for your respective onward journeys. Miss Worthington was sailing on in her case by train from Southampton to Vienna, where her piano teacher awaited her. Mr. Holland was disembarking at Southampton for his train home to Surrey. Mrs. Harrington was, like Miss Worthington, going onward by train, in her case, to her granddaughter's vicarage in Northumberland. You yourself were going to London. The four of you, in the quiet evening conversation that the 5th night produced, were beginning to register the imminent dispersal of the temporary society that the crossing had assembled, and the modest note of regret that this dispersal produced was beginning to enter the conversation in ways that the earlier nights had not had occasion to produce. After the dinner, you took a final long turn on the boat deck. The 5th night at sea is, on a 6-day crossing, the last full night before the arrival, and the boat deck on the 5th night had a particular intimate quality that the previous nights had not. The Atlantic on this 5th evening was particularly calm. The air on the deck was, for the first time in several days, almost still. The stars overhead were extraordinarily bright. The Duchess from the captain's table dinner, who had also taken the boat deck for the post-dinner walk, joined you for perhaps an hour at the rail. The two of you stood together at the stern, watching the wake of the ship spreading out behind into the darkness of the Atlantic, with the minor phosphorescence in the wake glowing faintly in the agitation of the propellers, and the great wheel of stars above us turning slowly toward the dawn that the 5th night of the eastbound voyage would, in due course, bring. It was during this narrow late hour at the rail with the Duchess that the conversation between you took on the particular reflective quality that long crossings occasionally produced. The Duchess had been for 50 years the wife of one of the senior English peers, and her widowhood was now in its 8th month, and the conversation that she had with you on the rear rail of the Olympic in the low late hour of the 5th night was, you understood in some sense, the conversation that she had been preparing in the private hours of her own widowed sleep for several months, and that she had needed an audience of the right age and the right disposition to be ready to deliver. She told you about the early years of her marriage, which had been, she said, by far the most difficult years of it, and which had produced in her, before they ended, the kind of private adjustments that the early years of a long marriage required of the women of her generation. She told you about her late husband's private kindnesses, which the public protocol of his ducal position had not, in the ordinary course of his life, permitted to be visible. She told you, with a careful directness that the late hour permitted, that the most important fact about marriage was that it took a long time to become what it would eventually be, and that the patience required for this slow becoming was, in her experience, considerably more than the popular novels of the era prepared the young wife to bring to it. The conversation was the kind of careful conversation between an older widow and a younger wife that English aristocratic society, in its better moments, occasionally produced, and you would, in the years that followed, return to it in your own private memory in ways that no other conversation of the crossing would inspire. You went to bed at midnight. The ship was, by your calculation from the Daily Bulletin, perhaps 6 hours from Cherbourg. You would be awake to see the minor French port in the dawn light. You slept lightly, in the specific way that the last night of a long crossing reliably produced. You woke at 5:30. The cabin was still dark, although the porthole, when you opened the dark velvet curtain, showed the first faint grey of the pre-dawn light over the eastern horizon. The motion of the ship was different. The engines, you could feel through the bulkhead behind your bed, had been throttled back from their cruising power. The ship was moving at perhaps 12 knots, in the careful approach to the harbour at Cherbourg that the deeper draught of a great liner required. The Cherbourg outer roadstead was too shallow for the Olympic to enter, and the embarkation and disembarkation of passengers at this French port was conducted, in the particular procedure that the line had developed, by means of a plain fleet of tenders that came out from the harbour to meet the ship at her anchorage in the outer roads. You rang for Hortense. She came. The dressing for the spare interruption of Cherbourg was a quick affair. A soft morning wrap, a modest breakfast tray brought up to the cabin so that you could take it at the porthole and watch the close approach to the French coast through the porthole as you ate. The French coast began to be visible at perhaps 6:30. The sky over the eastern horizon had brightened to the soft pink and gold of an August dawn, and against this dawn there began to appear, slowly, the minor dark line of the French coast. The line resolved itself, over the next half hour, into the particular outline of the headlands of the Cotentin Peninsula, with the breakwater of the Cherbourg outer harbour visible to the north, and the low cluster of the town and the harbour fortifications visible directly ahead. The ship was, by 7:30, anchored in the outer roads. The engines had been stopped. The slight residual motion of the swell at anchor was, after 5 days of the steady rolling of the open sea, a basic different motion that you registered with the thoughtful attention that the experienced crosser reliably brought to such transitions. The tenders from Cherbourg came out to meet the ship at perhaps 8 o'clock. There were 2 of them. They were plain steam launches, perhaps 150 feet long, decorated in the orange and black livery that the French Port Authority used for its minor craft, with the modest tricolour flying at the stern. They came alongside the ship at the embarkation doors on Dake Deck, on the starboard side, where the narrow platforms that the line used for the embarkation and disembarkation of passengers in port had been lowered to receive them. The disembarkation of passengers leaving the ship at Cherbourg, who were principally French and continental travellers going on to Paris and beyond, took perhaps an hour. The embarkation of new passengers boarding for the run to Southampton took a further hour. The luggage was loaded and unloaded in the careful operation that the tender's crews and the ship's stewards had been performing together for the previous several months. You watched the proceedings from the boat deck in the company of Mrs. Harrington, who had also come up to watch. The boat deck on the morning of the Cherbourg call was considerably more populated than it had been on the previous mornings of the crossing. with most of the first-class passengers having come up to watch the narrow spectacle of the port call. The disembarking passengers, of whom there were perhaps 100, were assembled on the lower deck where their luggage had been brought up from the cabins. The new passengers, of whom there were perhaps the same number, were waiting at the embarkation door for permission to come aboard. There was a low ceremony of the exchange of mail bags between the ship and the harbour authority. There was the careful registration of the new passengers with the chief steward. It was during this Cherbourg call that you also saw, in the plain distant way that the Sunday service had earlier permitted, the third-class passengers who were boarding at this port. They came up the brief narrower gangway on a separate part of the embarkation deck. They were a smaller group than the first-class boarders, perhaps 30 in total, and they were a particular modest flotilla of working travellers, French and Belgian, and a close group who appeared to be Russians or Eastern Europeans of some kind, who were boarding for the brief run to Southampton, and from there going on presumably to other ships or other destinations. They were carrying their possessions in the small canvas bags and battered trunks that the third-class luggage of the era reliably consisted of. They were directed by the third-class stewards to the appropriate minor entrance to the third-class accommodation at the rear of the ship. They disappeared, as they had at the close of the Sunday service, into the narrow invisible portion of the ship that the first-class passenger did not encounter. The ship raised her anchor at 9:20. The engines, throttled back to manoeuvring power, took her slowly out of the Cherbourg roadstead into the open channel, where once the low navigation through the offshore traffic had been accomplished, the engines were brought back up to the full cruising speed for the brief run to Southampton. The run from Cherbourg to Southampton was, in the particular geography of the eastbound crossing, a matter of perhaps 100 miles, and it would take, at the ship's standard cruising speed, slightly under 5 hours. The ship was scheduled to arrive at Southampton at 3 in the afternoon. The remaining hours of the crossing would be the closing portion of the voyage, with the principal lunch on board to be taken in the dining saloon, and the final little disembarkation tasks to be completed. You had lunch with Mrs. Harrington and Miss Worthington and Mr. Holland in the dining saloon at 1. The lunch was the standard buffet and hot dishes lunch that the previous days had produced. The conversation between the four of you was, on this final lunch of the crossing, the careful exchange of farewells and the careful exchange of forwarding addresses that the closing meals of long crossings reliably produced. Mrs. Harrington gave you her granddaughter's address in Northumberland, in the unlikely event that you should ever find yourself in the area. Mr. Holland gave you the minor business card of his city office, with the narrow offer that should you or your husband ever require any low advice in matters of shipping insurance, his firm would be at your service. Miss Worthington gave you the address of her piano teacher in Vienna and the address of her parents' house in Chicago. You gave each of the three of them the direct calling card with your London address. The exchange of addresses was the closing ritual of an Atlantic Crossings table groupings, and it produced in the four of you the little wistful sense that the modest temporary society that the dining saloon had assembled was now in its final hour. After lunch, you returned to the cabin for the final preparations that the disembarkation required. Hortense had been at work for several hours, repacking the trunks that the previous day's quiet rest had permitted her to begin organizing. The 4 wardrobe trunks were now closed and locked, with their minor leather travel labels indicating their destination: Mrs. Charles Whitmore, 14 Onslow Square, South Kensington, London, by way of the boat train from Southampton. The smaller trunks were similarly labelled. The dressing case was still partially open for the final morning's toilette, but it would be closed and packed at the last moment before the disembarkation. The cabin, when you walked into it, had returned to the impersonal, beautifully appointed stateroom that it had been when you first arrived. The narrow personal touches that had transformed it into your room in your 6-day occupancy were now packed away, and the room was beginning, in its low inanimate way, to prepare itself for the next passenger who would occupy it on the next crossing. You took a final turn on the boat deck at 2:30. The English Channel on a fine August afternoon was, in its particular quality, a different sea from the Atlantic that had been your companion for the previous 5 days. The Channel was a busier sea. There were ships visible in every direction, fishing boats, coastal traders, smaller passenger ferries crossing between France and England, a simple Royal Navy cruiser visible on the horizon to the south. The shore of England was by 2:30 visible to the north, the plain chalk cliffs of the south coast, the little low green hills of Hampshire behind them, the modest lighthouses and the harbour entrances visible on the headlands. The ship was approaching Southampton through the Solent, the narrow channel between the Isle of Wight and the mainland, and the small pilot boat from the Southampton Pilotage Authority was already making its way out to meet her for the final approach to the harbour. The arrival at Southampton was, in its minor distinct way, the formal closing of the crossing. The ship moved slowly through the Solent at perhaps 8 knots, with the harbour pilot now on the bridge and the engines back at manoeuvring power. The Isle of Wight was visible to the south, with the narrow holiday town of Cowes visible on its northern shore, the great yachting station where the Royal Yacht Squadron held its annual regatta, which had ended only a fortnight earlier, and the low evidence of which was still visible in the simple scattering of yachts moored in the Cowes roads. The mainland was visible to the north, the plain town of Leamington, the great Hampshire forest of the New Forest extending inland behind the coast, the little entrance to the Hamble River that led to the modest upriver town of Bursleden. The whole geography of the south coast of England was, in the careful afternoon light of late August, the narrow visible reminder that you were finally home, although home in this sense was the country that your marriage had made into your country rather than the country of your birth. The ship arrived at the Southampton quay at 3 in the afternoon. The 2 great tugs of the Southampton Harbour Authority brought her alongside the dock with the measured precision that the harbour pilots had developed over many years of berthing the great liners. The lines were made fast. The gangways were brought up to the embarkation doors. The disembarkation of the first-class passengers began at 3:20. You and Hortense were among the first off the ship. The chief steward of B Deck, Mr. Andrews, escorted you to the gangway with the careful courtesy that he had brought to your service throughout the crossing. You said your farewells to him at the head of the gangway. He thanked you for your custom. He hoped, he said, that he would have the pleasure of welcoming you aboard again in due course. You said, with the particular warmth that the close of a successful crossing reliably produced, that you hoped so also. You walked down the gangway. You stepped onto the dock at Southampton. You were finally on English soil. The boat train to London was waiting at the dock. The boat train was the particular convenience that the major shipping lines had arranged for their passengers, with the London and South Western Railway providing a special train that ran direct from the Southampton dock to Waterloo Station, with first-class carriages reserved for the first-class passengers of the ship, second-class carriages for the second class, and a modest additional set of third-class carriages for the third-class passengers who were going on to London by this route rather than by the slower regular trains. The boat train was scheduled to depart at 4. The first-class baggage was loaded directly from the ship's hold into the baggage car of the boat train. The first-class passengers, with their hand luggage and their personal servants, took their seats in the first-class carriages. You took your seat in a first-class compartment of the boat train. The compartment was the standard first-class compartment of an English railway of the era. 6 seats, 3 on each side, in the soft blue plush upholstery of the London and South Western Railway, with the small framed pictures of railway scenes above the seats, and the minor antimacassars at the headrests, and the narrow windows that could be lowered by a leather strap. Hortense was in the adjacent second-class compartment with the personal servants of the other first-class passengers. The luggage was in the baggage car. The whistle blew at 4 o'clock. The train pulled out of the Southampton Dock station and began the run north through Hampshire toward London. The journey from Southampton to Waterloo took, in the measured schedule of the London and South Western Railway, approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes. The train ran north through the Hampshire countryside, with the simple fields and the plain villages and the little market towns of southern England passing the windows of the compartment in the soft late afternoon light of an August evening. The shadows lengthened. The modest sun, low in the western sky, began to take on the particular gold colour that the close of an English summer day reliably produced. The country was, on the run between Southampton and London, at its full late summer beauty, the harvest substantially in the small fields, golden with stubble, the minor woods still in their late summer green. You watched it all from the window of the compartment. You realized in the private way that long journeys produced these realizations, slightly tired. The crossing had been, in its low accumulated way, more demanding than you had remembered the previous crossings to be. You closed your eyes for perhaps 15 minutes. The brief movement of the train through the Hampshire countryside became, in the half-sleep that the closed eyes permitted, the simple additional motion that the long sequence of motions of the past 6 days had now produced. The train arrived at Waterloo Station at 6:20. The platform at Waterloo, when the train drew in, was the long, low-covered platform of the great Victorian station, with the gas lamps lit against the falling evening, with the plain bustle of porters and travellers, and the little continuous murmur of the great London terminus. You stepped out of the compartment. Hortense was waiting at the door of her compartment with the modest overnight bag that contained the things you would need for the immediate evening. The luggage would be sent on by a separate carrier service. The platform was full of the small parties of those meeting the boat train. He was at the platform, your husband. He was standing at the minor barrier at the end of the platform, in his Foreign Office black coat and his narrow black bowler hat, with the low bouquet of late summer flowers that he had brought for you, in the particular gesture that he had developed over the course of your 3 years of marriage for the meetings of you at stations after long absences. You walked along the platform to him. He embraced you in the careful Englishman's embrace that the public setting of a station permitted. He kissed you on the cheek. He gave you the flowers. He took the little overnight bag from Hortense, who was directed by him to a particular modest porter, who would help her with the further matter of getting the immediate luggage to the minor motor car that he had brought to collect you. The whole reunion, in its careful Edwardian way, was the kind of reunion that married couples of his class and country had been conducting on the platforms of Waterloo Station for the previous several decades, and it was, for all the careful restraint of its public expression, one of the low, genuine happinesses of your life. You took the simple motor car to your house in Onslow Square. The streets of London in the early evening of a late August Tuesday were the streets of a city in the closing weeks of its quietest season. Most of the wealthy still at the country, the parliamentary session not yet resumed, the plain sense of suspended life that London in late August reliably produced. The motor car ran through the streets in the little lengthening light of the evening. You sat beside your husband in the rear seat. You held his hand. You spoke with him the considered exchange of news that the first hour of a reunion after a 6-week absence required. The crossing was over. You were home. I want to spend, before we close, a few moments with the larger picture of the crossing we have just walked through. The Olympic in 1911 was, as I have said, the most magnificent moving object that the human civilization of the time had yet produced. She had been built at a cost that would have built a small cathedral. She had been designed by the most careful marine architects of her generation. She had been fitted out by the most accomplished interior designers and craftsmen that the Belfast yards could employ. She represented, in her single self, one of the minor high points of a particular phase of human technical and artistic ambition that the Edwardian era had brought to its full pitch. To have crossed the Atlantic on her in the late summer of 1911, in the first-class accommodation, was to have inhabited for 6 days a narrow artificial paradise that the wealth of an entire generation had been concentrated to produce. The food, the wine, the music, the rooms, the considered services of the cabin stewards and the dining stewards and the bath attendants and the deck stewards, the deliberate institutional memory of the chief stewards who knew your tea preferences from a previous crossing, the considered Jacobean dining saloon and the considered Louis Quinze lounge and the considered Pompeian Turkish bath and the considered Georgian writing room, all of these together represented the height of what the wealthy of the era had decided that human comfort at sea should consist of. The crossing was, in its specific way, the floating equivalent of one of the great London or New York establishments, and it was, for the duration of its 6 days, one of the genuine pleasures that the era was capable of producing. The era itself, of course, had a finite span. 3 years from the August evening on which Charlotte and the Duchess stood at the rail of the Olympic, and the Duchess gave the measured conversation about the early years of marriage, Europe would be at war. The world that had built the Olympic, the world of the careful 3-class organization of the great liners, and the careful Foreign Office husbands, and the careful captains' tables, and the careful 3rd-class emigrants returning to the home countries with the accumulated savings of years of work in the American factories, would be substantially destroyed by the events of the 4 years that began in August 1914. The Olympic would, as I have said, be requisitioned for war service in 1915, and would carry hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic for the next 4 years. Her sister would be lying on the bottom of the North Atlantic for the duration. Captain Smith would be dead. Many of the men who had stood in the reception room with Charlotte on the first evening of the crossing, in their evening dress, with their minor wine and their small canapes, would by 1918 be dead. Some of the women would have lost husbands and brothers and sons. The whole social apparatus of the captain's table dinners and the post-dinner dances and the deliberate 3-class organization of the great liners would be by 1919 considerably altered, and the relatively brief subsequent period of the interwar years, when the great liners continued in service in their slightly diminished form, would never quite recapture the distinct high pitch of the Edwardian summer that the Olympic in 1911 had represented. None of this is yet visible from the rear seat of the motor car as you and your husband ride through the evening streets of London toward your house in South Kensington. The world that you are inhabiting in the closing minutes of our story is the world at the close of its long high summer, with 3 years still to run before the small, terrible interruption that ended it. You do not know that the interruption is coming. You will not know it, in any meaningful sense, until the August of 1914, 3 years from now, when the brief Foreign Office telegrams from the Foreign Office will begin to arrive at your husband's office with increasing frequency, and the formal dinners of the London season will begin to take on the faint undercurrent of anxiety that the events of the Balkan summer that year will produce. The crossing you have just completed is one of the minor good things that the era was, in its quiet way, producing for the people who could afford it. It will not, as a kind of experience, be available again in quite the same form for very much longer. But it has, on this August evening in 1911, occurred. It has happened. The small accumulated set of impressions that the 6 days have produced, the grand staircase under its dome, the orchestra in the veranda cafe, the bouillon at 11 on the boat deck, the captain's table dinner with Morgan and the Duchess and the novelist, the fog on the Grand Banks, the Sunday divine service with Captain Smith in his dress uniform, the Duchess at the rail in the late hour of the 5th night, the French port of Cherbourg in the dawn, the boat train through the Hampshire countryside, the husband at Waterloo with the bouquet of late summer flowers, has been added to the permanent stock of your private memories, and you will carry it forward into the years that follow. I want to leave you, before I let you go to sleep, with the single picture that I think captures the crossing best. It is not the picture of the grand staircase. It is not the picture of the captain's table. It is not the picture of the dining saloon under the chandeliers with the orchestra playing. It is the picture of the boat deck on the 5th night of the crossing, with you and the Duchess at the rear rail. It is the picture of two women, one in the closing months of her formal year of mourning, one in the early years of her marriage, standing at the rail of the most magnificent ship in the world, in the middle of the open Atlantic, under the great wheel of stars that the absence of city lights had made fully visible, with the faint phosphorescence of the wake glowing in the dark water below, and the deep engine hum of the engines beneath their feet, and the measured conversation between them about the slow, long becoming of marriage and the private kindnesses that long marriages eventually produce. The whole crossing, in some sense, was assembling itself toward that picture. The careful organization of the dining saloon and the lounge and the veranda cafe and the writing room and the Turkish bath and the gymnasium and the reception room, all of the intricate apparatus that the White Star Line had built into the Olympic, was in the end producing only the conditions in which a measured conversation between two women at a rail in the middle of the Atlantic could occur. The luxury of the ship was the means. The conversation was the end. The wealthy of any era, when they have built the most elaborate pleasure machines that their wealth permits them to build, find that what the machines actually produce at their best moments is the private encounter that simpler arrangements would equally have permitted. The crossing was, in this sense, both extraordinary and quite ordinary. It was in its strange great way simply a journey with the gathered set of brief encounters and vivid impressions that any journey produces, dressed in the particular extravagance of its setting, but reducible at the end to the same human substance. You, in your bed wherever you are now, with the lights low and the minor distractions of your day receding, are perhaps approaching a similar inner substance of your own. The crossing we have walked through tonight is gone. The Olympic was broken up at the yards in Jarrow in 1935, and the small surviving pieces of her interior, the grand staircase clock, the carved oak panels from the dining saloon, the small wrought iron and glass dome, were sold to private collectors and to hotels in northeast England, where some of them survive to this day. Charlotte, in the small invented version of her that we have walked through the crossing with, lived a long, full life as the wife of a Foreign Office gentleman, through the wars and the long interwar years and the early years of the Second War, and died at her London house in the spring of 1962, having had 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and a marriage that turned out, over its 48 years, to be exactly the slow, long becoming that the Duchess had told her about at the rail on the 5th night of the crossing of 1911. The single picture of the two women at the rail under the stars in the middle of the Atlantic remained with her throughout the years as one of the small reliable images of her younger life, and she would, in her old age in the years before her death, occasionally bring it out and consider it again. I will leave you, now, with that image. The two women at the rear rail of the Olympic on the fifth night of the eastbound crossing of August 1911, the great wheel of stars overhead, the faint phosphorescence of the wake glowing in the dark water below, the deep engine hum of the engines through the deck, the small, slow turning of the night Atlantic under the ship that is moving eastward at 21 knots toward the dawn that is somewhere over the curving horizon ahead, the measured conversation between the older woman and the younger that the late hour and the open sea and the small peculiar privacy of the boat deck on the fifth night of a long crossing reliably permitted. The ship would survive. She would carry in the years that came the soldiers of two armies through two wars, would earn her affectionate nickname Old Reliable, would steam through 24 years of working life and end her career with the sound of cheering crowds at the dockside of Southampton when she made her final entry into the harbour in 1935. The two women at the rail would, in their respective ways, also survive. The era they inhabited would not, but the crossing had occurred. The conversation had occurred. The gathering evidence of the human capacity to produce, even in the face of what the future was about to bring, the brief great moments of careful warmth that justified the elaborate apparatus that had been built to make them possible. That evidence had been added to the permanent stock of what the world contained. Sleep well. The Olympic is making her steady eastward progress through the night Atlantic of August 1911. Charlotte is asleep in her cabin. The Duchess is asleep in her parlour suite. Captain Smith is on the bridge in the attentive watch that the night hours of an Atlantic crossing required of him. Mr. Andrews, the chief steward, is in his small cabin off the staircase, with the private record of the day's services entered in the notebook that his profession required him to keep. Mrs. Harrington is asleep in her cabin. Miss Worthington is asleep in hers. Mr. Holland is asleep in his. The orchestra has packed away the music for the night, in the meticulous way that Wallace Hartley always supervised. The Marconi operators are at their desks in the wireless room, in the continuous watch that the new technology required to be kept through the night. The kitchens are silent, in the brief few hours of their daily rest. The boilers below decks are at their cruising power, with the engineers on the night watch attending to them. The clock at the foot of the grand staircase is ticking in the empty foyer. The little lamps in the corridors are burning low. The whole of the great ship is, in the distinct way of a liner at night, asleep with the careful awareness that even in sleep she is moving through the dark sea toward the dawn she will, in due course, reach. I will see you in the next one.